once to Jamaica Inn to seize my uncle before it is too late. I'm giving this note to your housekeeper, who will, I trust, lay it where your eyes will fall upon it directly you return. In haste, then, Mary Yellan. This she folded and gave to the woman by her side, thanking her and assuring her that she had no fear of the road, and so set out again upon a walk of 4 miles or more to North Hill. She climbed the hill from Alton with a heavy heart and a wretched sense of isolation. She had placed such faith in Francis Davy that it was hard to realize even yet that by his absence he had failed her. He had not known, of course, that she needed him, and even if he had, perhaps his plans would have come before her troubles. It was disheartening and bitter to leave the lights of Alton behind her, with nothing as yet accomplished. At this moment, perhaps, her uncle was thundering upon her bedroom door, calling her to answer. He would wait a moment and then force the door. He would find her gone, and the smashed window would tell him the manner of her going. Whether this would play havoc with his plans was a matter for conjecture. She could not know. Aunt Patience was her concern, and the thought of her setting out upon the journey like a shivering dog, tethered to its master, made Mary run along the bare white road with fists clenched and chin thrust in the air. She came at last to the turnpike and turned down the narrow twisting lane as the woman in Alton had told her. High hedges screened the country on either side, and the dark moor was thrust away and hidden from her eyes. The road twisted and turned, as the lanes in Helford used to do, and this change of scene, coming so suddenly after the bleak highroad, put faith in her once more. She cheered herself by painting a picture of the Bassett family as kindly and courteous, like the Vivians at Trello Warren, who would listen to her with sympathy and understanding. She had not seen the squire at his best before. He had come upon Jamaica Inn in high ill-humour, and she thought now with regret of the part she had played in his deception. As for his lady, she must know now that a horse-thief had made a fool of her in Launceston Market Square, and it was lucky for Mary that she had not stood at Jem's side when the pony was sold back to his rightful owner. She continued with her fantasy of the Bassetts, but the little incidents came back to her in spite of it, and at the bottom of her heart she looked upon the approaching interview with trepidation. The contour of the land had changed again, and hills rose away from her, forested and dark, and somewhere beyond her ran a stream, singing and breaking over stones. The moorland was no more. The moon came now, topping the farther trees, and she walked in confidence, with the light blazing a path for her, leading her downwards to the valley, where the trees closed in friendliness upon her. She came at last to lodge gates, and the entrance to a drive, while beyond her the lane continued to a village. That must be North Hill, and this the manor house belonging to the squire. She went down the avenue to the house, and away in the distance a church clock struck 7. She had been about 3 hours already from Jamaica Inn. Her nervousness returned as she rounded upon the house, large and forbidding in the darkness, with the moon not yet risen high enough to shine kindly upon it. She swung the great bell, and the sound was met at once by the furious baying of hounds. She waited, and presently she heard footsteps from within, and the door was opened by a manservant. He called sharply at the dogs, who thrust their noses at the door and sniffed at Mary's feet. She felt inferior and small, and was conscious of her old dress and shawl before this man who waited for her to speak. "I have come to see Mr. Bassett on very urgent business," she told him. "He would not know my name, but if he could speak to me for a few minutes I would explain. The matter is of desperate importance, otherwise I would not disturb him at such an hour, and on a Sunday night." "Mr. Bassett left for Launceston this morning," answered the man. "He was called away hurriedly, and he has not yet returned." This time Mary could not control herself, and a cry of despair escaped her. "I have come some way," she said, in an agony of feeling, as though by her very distress she could bring the squire to her side. "If I do not see him within the hour, something terrible will happen, and a great criminal escape the hands of the law. You look at me blankly, but I am speaking the truth. If only there were someone I could turn to—" "Mrs. Bassett is at home," said the man, stunned with curiosity. "Perhaps she will see you if your business is as urgent as you say. Follow me, will you, to the library? Never mind the dogs, they will not hurt you." Mary crossed the hall in a dream, knowing only that her plan had failed again, through chance alone, and that she was powerless now to help herself. The wide library with its blazing fire seemed unreal to her, and accustomed as she was to the darkness, she blinked at the flood of light that met her eyes. A woman whom she recognized immediately as the fine lady from Launceston Market Square was sitting in a chair before the fire, reading aloud to 2 children, and she looked up in surprise when Mary was shown into the room. The servant began his explanation in some excitement. "This young woman has very grave news for the squire, madam," he said. "I thought it best to show her in to you directly." Mrs. Bassett rose to her feet at once, dropping the book from her lap. "It isn't one of the horses, is it?" she said. "Richard told me Solomon had been coughing, and that Diamond would not take his food. With this undergroom anything may happen." Mary shook her head. "Your household is not in trouble," she said gravely. "I bring news of another kind. If I could speak to you alone—" Mrs. Bassett appeared relieved that her horses were not affected, and she spoke quickly to her children, who ran from the room, followed by the manservant. "What can I do for you?" she said graciously. "You look pale and fatigued. Won't you sit down?" Mary shook her head impatiently. "Thank you, but I must know when Mr. Bassett is returning home." "I have no idea," replied his lady. "He was obliged to leave this morning at a moment's notice, and, to tell you the truth, I am seriously concerned about him. If this dreadful innkeeper shows fight, as he is certain to do, Mr. Bassett may be wounded in spite of the soldiers." "What do you mean?" said Mary. "Why, the squire has set out upon a highly dangerous mission. Your face is new to me, and I conclude you are not from North Hill. Otherwise you would have heard of this man Merlyn, who keeps an inn upon the Bodmin Road. The squire has suspected him for some while of terrible crimes, but it was not until this morning that the full proof came into his hands. He departed at once for Launceston to summon help, and from what he told me before he went, he intends to surround the inn tonight and seize the inhabitants. He will go well armed, of course, and with a large body of men, but I shall not rest until he returns." Something in Mary's face must have warned her, for she turned very pale, and backed towards the fire, reaching out for the heavy bell-pull that hung on the wall. "You are the girl he spoke about," she said quickly. "The girl from the inn, the niece of the landlord. Stay where you are, don't move, or I will summon my servants. You are the girl, I know it. He described you to me. What do you want with me?" Mary put out her hand, her face as white as the woman's by the fire. "I won't hurt you," she said. "Please do not ring. Let me explain. Yes, I am the girl from Jamaica Inn." Mrs. Bassett did not trust her. She watched Mary with troubled eyes, and kept her hand upon the bell-rope. "I have no money here," she said. "I can do nothing for you. If you have come to North Hill to plead for your uncle, it is too late." "You misunderstand me," said Mary. "And the landlord of Jamaica Inn is a relative to me by marriage only. Why I have been living there does not matter now, and the story would take too long in the telling. I fear and detest him more than you or anyone in the country, and with reason. I came here tonight to warn Mr. Bassett that the landlord intended to leave the inn tonight, and so escape justice. I have definite proof of his guilt, which I did not believe Mr. Bassett to possess. You tell me that he is already gone, and perhaps even now is at Jamaica Inn. Therefore I have wasted my time in coming here." She sat down then, her hands in her lap, and stared blankly at the fire. She had come to the end of her resources, and for the moment she could not look ahead. All that her weary mind could tell her was that her labour of the evening had been purposeless and in vain. She need never have left her bedroom at Jamaica Inn. Mr. Bassett would have come in any case. And now, by her secret meddling, she had blundered into the very mistake she had wished to avoid. She had stayed away too long, and by now her uncle would have guessed the truth and in all probability made his escape. Squire Bassett and his men would ride to a deserted inn. She lifted her eyes once more to the lady of the house. "I have done a very senseless thing in coming here," she said. "I thought it clever, and I have only succeeded in making a fool of myself and of everyone else.
My uncle will discover my room is empty, and guess at once that I have betrayed him. He will leave Jamaica Inn before Mr. Bassett arrives."
The squire's lady let go of the bell-rope now, and came towards her.
"You speak sincerely, and you have an honest face," she said kindly. "I am sorry if I misjudged you at first, but Jamaica Inn has a terrible name, and I believe anyone would have done the same had they been confronted suddenly with the landlord's niece. You have been placed in a fearful position, and I think you very brave to come here tonight, all those lonely miles, to warn my husband. I should have gone mad with fear. The question is this: what would you have me do now? I am willing to help you in any way you think best." "There is nothing we can do," said Mary, shaking her head. "I must wait here, I suppose, until Mr. Bassett returns. He won't be over-pleased to see me when he hears how I've blundered. God knows I deserve every reproach." "I will speak for you," replied Mrs. Bassett. "You could not possibly know my husband had already been informed, and I will soon smooth him down if he needs it. Be thankful you are here in safety meanwhile." "How did the squire learn the truth so suddenly?" asked Mary. "I have not the slightest idea. He was sent for very suddenly this morning, as I have told you already, and he only gave me the barest details before his horse was saddled and he was gone. Now, won't you rest yourself, and forget for the time the whole hateful business? You're probably famished for want of food."
Once more she approached the fireplace, and this time she pulled the bell-rope 3 or 4 times. For all her worry and distress, Mary could not help seeing the irony of the situation. Here was the lady of the house offering hospitality, who a moment ago had threatened her with seizure by the same servants who would now bring her food. She thought also of the scene in the market square when this same lady, in velvet cloak and feathered hat, had paid a high price for her own pony, and she wondered whether the trickery had been discovered. If Mary's own part in the deception should come to light, Mrs. Bassett would hardly be so lavish with her hospitality. Meanwhile the servant appeared, his inquisitive nose in the air, and was told by his mistress to bring a tray of supper for Mary, and the dogs who had followed him into the room came now to make friends with the stranger, wagging their tails and pushing their soft noses into her hands, accepting her as a member of the household. Her presence in the manor house at North Hill was still without reality, and though Mary tried, she could not throw aside anxiety and relax. She felt she had no right to be sitting here before a glowing fire, when outside, in the darkness, life and death fought hand to hand before Jamaica Inn. She ate mechanically, forcing herself to swallow the food she needed, aware of the prattle of her hostess at her side, who in the mistaken kindness of her heart believed that incessant conversation about nothing at all was the only method of alleviating worry. The chatter, had she but realized it, increased it, and when Mary had finished her supper and sat once more with her hands on her lap, staring at the fire, Mrs. Bassett, searching in her mind for suitable distraction, fetched an album of her own watercolours and proceeded to turn the pages for the benefit of her guest. When the clock on the mantelpiece chimed 8 o'clock in piercing tones, Mary could bear it no longer. This dragging inactivity was worse than danger and pursuit. "Forgive me," she said, rising to her feet. "You have been so kind, and I can never thank you enough. But I am anxious, desperately anxious. I can think of nothing but my poor aunt, who at this moment may be suffering the tortures of hell. I must know what is happening at Jamaica Inn, if I walk back there myself tonight." Mrs. Bassett dropped her album in a flutter of distress. "Of course you are anxious. I have seen it all along and tried to take your mind off it. How terrible it is! I am as concerned as you are, for my husband's sake. But you cannot possibly walk back there now alone. Why, it would be after midnight before you arrived, and heaven knows what might not happen to you on the way. I will order the trap, and Richards shall go with you. He is most trustworthy and dependable, and can be armed in case of need. If there is fighting in progress, you would see it from the bottom of the hill and would not approach until it was over. I would come with you myself, but my health is delicate at the moment, and—" "Of course you will do nothing of the kind," said Mary. "I'm used to danger in the road by night, and you are not.
I shall be putting you to very great trouble in harnessing your horse at this hour and rousing your groom. I assure you I'm no longer tired, and I can walk."
But Mrs. Bassett had already pulled the bell.
"Have word sent to Richards to bring the trap round immediately," she said to the astonished servant. "I will give him further orders when he arrives. Tell him there must be as little delay as possible."
She then fitted Mary out with a heavy cloak and hood, a thick rug and foot-warmer, protesting all the while that only her state of health prevented her from making the journey too, for which Mary was utterly thankful, Mrs. Bassett being hardly the ideal companion for so improvident and dangerous an escapade. In a quarter of an hour the trap drove up to the door, with Richards in charge, Mary recognizing him at once as the servant who had ridden with Mr. Bassett originally to Jamaica Inn. His reluctance at leaving his fireside on a Sunday night was soon overcome when he learnt his mission, and with 2 large pistols stuck in his belt, and orders to fire at anyone who threatened the trap, he assumed at once an air of truculence and authority hitherto unknown to him. Mary climbed in beside him, the dogs baying a chorus of farewell, and it was only when the drive twisted and the house was out of sight that Mary realized she had set out on what was probably to be a foolhardy and dangerous expedition. Anything might have happened during the 5 hours she had been absent from Jamaica Inn, and even with the trap she could scarcely hope to arrive there before 10:30. She could make no plans, and her action depended upon the moment when it came. With the moon now high in the sky, and the soft air blowing upon her, she felt emboldened to face disaster when it came, and this ride to the scene of action, however dangerous, was better than sitting like a helpless child listening to the prattle of Mrs. Bassett. This man Richards was armed, and she herself would use a gun if necessary. He was burning with curiosity, of course, but she gave short answers to his questions and did not encourage him. The drive was silent then, for the most part, with no other sound but the steady clopping of the horses' hoofs upon the road, and now and again an owl hooted from the still trees. The rustle of hedgerow and the creeping country whispers were left behind when the trap came out upon the Bodmin road, and once again the dark moor stretched out on either side, lapping the road like a desert. The ribbon of the highway shone white under the moon. It wound and was lost in the fold of the farther hill, bare and untrodden. There were no travellers but themselves upon the road tonight. On Christmas Eve, when Mary had ridden here, the wind had lashed venomously at the carriage wheels, and the rain hammered the windows. Now the air was still cold and strangely still, and the moor itself lay placid and silver in the moonlight. The dark tors held their sleeping faces to the sky, the granite features softened and smoothed by the light that bathed them. Theirs was a peaceful mood, and the old gods slept undisturbed. Briskly the horse and trap covered the weary miles that Mary had walked alone. She recognized each bend in the high road now, and how at times the moor encroached upon it, with high tufts of grass or twisted stem of broom. There, beyond her in the valley, would be the lights of Altonan, and already the 5 lanes branched out from the road like fingers from a hand. The wild stretch to Jamaica lay before them. Even when the night was still, the wind played here, bare and open as it was to every compass point, and tonight it hummed from Rough Tor in the west, keen as a knife and cold, gathering the marsh smells as it came over the bitter turf and the running streams. There was still no sign of man or beast upon the road, which rose and dipped again across the moor, and though Mary strained her eyes and ears, she could hear nothing. On such a night the slightest sound would be magnified, and the approach of Mr. Bassett's party, numbering as they would 12 men or so, said Richards, would easily be heard 2 miles or more away. "We shall find them there before us, as likely as not," he told Mary, "and the landlord with his hands bound breathing fire at the squire. It'll be a good thing for the neighbourhood when he's put out of harm's way. And he would have been before now if the squire could have had his way. It's a pity we were not here sooner. There'll have been some sport in taking him, I reckon."
"Little sport if Mr. Bassett finds that his bird has flown," said Mary. "Joss Merlyn knows these moors like the back of his hand, and he'll not linger once he has the start of an hour or less than that."
"My master was bred here, same as the landlord," said Richards. "If it comes to a chase across country, I'd lay odds on the squire every time. He's hunted here, man and boy, for nearly 50 years, I should say, and where a fox will go, the squire will follow. But they'll catch this one before he starts to run, if I'm not mistaken." Mary let him continue. His occasional jerky statements did not worry her, as the kindly prattle of his mistress had done, and his broad back and honest, rugged face gave her some confidence in this night of strain. They were approaching the dip in the road and the narrow bridge that spanned the River Foy. Mary could hear the ripple and play of the stream as it ran swiftly over the stones. The steep hill to Jamaica rose in front of them, white beneath the moon, and as the dark chimneys appeared above the crest, Richards fell silent, fumbling with the pistols in his belt, and he cleared his throat with a little nervous jerk of his head. Mary's heart beat fast now, and she held tight to the side of the trap. The horse bent to the climb, his head low, and it seemed to Mary that the clip of his hoofs rang too loudly on the surface of the road, and she wished they had been more silent. As they drew near to the summit of the hill, Richards turned and whispered in her ear, "Would it be best for you to wait here in the trap by the side of the road, and I go forward and see if they're there?" Mary shook her head. "Better for me to go, and you follow a pace or two behind, or stay here and wait until I call. From the silence, it seems as though the squire and his party are not yet come after all, and that the landlord has escaped. Should he be there, however, my uncle, I mean, I can risk an encounter with him when you could not. Give me a pistol. I shall have little to fear from him then." "I hardly think it right for you to go alone," said the man. "You may walk right into him, and I hear no sound from you again. Strange, as you say, this silence. I'd expected shouting and fighting, and my master's voice topping it all. It's almost unnatural in a way. They must have been detained in Launceston. I half fancy there'd be more wisdom if we turned aside down that track there, and waited for them to come." "I've waited long enough tonight, and gone half mad with it," said Mary. "I'd rather come upon my uncle face to face than lie here in the ditch, seeing and hearing nothing. It's my aunt I'm thinking of. She's as innocent as a child in all this business, and I want to care for her if I can. Give me a pistol and let me go. I can tread like a cat, and I'll not run my head into a noose, I promise you." She threw off the heavy cloak and hood that had protected her from the cold night air, and seized hold of the pistol that he handed down to her reluctantly. "Don't follow me unless I give a call, or give some signal," she said. "Should you hear a shot fired, then perhaps it would be as well to come after me. But come warily for all that. There's no need for both of us to run like fools into danger. For my part, I believe my uncle to have gone." She hoped now that he had, and by driving into Devon made an end of the whole business. The country would be rid of him, and in the cheapest possible way. He might, even as he had said, start life again, or more likely still, dig himself in somewhere, 500 miles from Cornwall, and drink himself to death. She had no interest now in his capture. She wanted it finished and thrust aside. She wanted above all to lead her own life and forget him, and to put the world between her and Jamaica Inn. Revenge was an empty thing. To see him bound and helpless, surrounded by the squire and his men, would be of little satisfaction. She had spoken to Richards with confidence, but for all that she dreaded an encounter with her uncle, armed as she was, and the thought of coming upon him suddenly in the passage of the inn, with his hands ready to strike, and his bloodshot eyes staring down upon her, made her pause in her stride before the yard, and glance back to the dark shadow in the ditch that was Richards and the trap. Then she levelled her pistol, her finger upon the trigger, and looked round the corner of the stone wall to the yard. It was empty. The stable door was shut. The inn was as dark and silent as when she had left it nearly 7 hours before, and the windows and the door were barred. She looked up to her window, and the pane of glass gaped empty and wide, unchanged since she had climbed from it that afternoon. There were no wheel marks in the yard, no preparations for departure. She crept across to the stable and laid her ear against the door. She waited a moment, and then she heard the pony move restlessly in his stall. She heard his hoofs clink on the cobbles. Then they had not gone, and her uncle was still at Jamaica Inn. Her heart sank, and she wondered if she should return to Richards and the trap and wait, as he had suggested, until Squire Bassett and his men arrived. She glanced once more at the shuttered house. Surely, if her uncle intended to leave, he would have gone before now. The cart alone would take an hour to load, and it must be nearly 11 o'clock. He might have altered his plans and decided to go on foot, but then Aunt Patience could never accompany him. Mary hesitated. The situation had become odd now, and unreal. She stood by the porch and listened. She even tried the handle of the door. It was locked, of course. She ventured a little way round the corner of the house, past the entrance to the bar, and so to the patch of garden behind the kitchen. She trod softly now, keeping herself in shadow, and she came to where a chink of candlelight would show through the gap in the kitchen shutter. There was no light. She stepped close now to the shutter, and laid her eye against the slit. The kitchen was as black as a pit. She laid her hand on the door of the knob, and slowly turned it. It gave, to her astonishment, and the door opened. This easy entrance, entirely unforeseen, shocked her for the moment, and she was afraid to enter, supposing her uncle sat on his chair waiting for her, his gun across his knee. She had her own pistol, but it gave her no confidence. Very slowly she laid her face to the gap made by the door. No sound came to her. Out of the tail of her eye she could see the ashes of the fire, but the glow was almost gone. She knew then that nobody was there. Some instinct told her that the kitchen had been empty for hours. She pushed the door wide and went inside. The room struck cold and damp. She waited until her eyes had become accustomed to the darkness, and she could make out the shape of the kitchen table and the chair beside it. There was a candle on the table, and she thrust it into the feeble glow of the fire, where it took light and flickered. When it burnt strong enough, she held it high above her head and looked about her. The kitchen was still strewn with the preparations for departure. There was a bundle belonging to Aunt Patience on the chair, and a heap of blankets lay on the floor, ready to be rolled. In the corner of the room, where it always stood, was her uncle's gun. They had decided then to wait for another day, and were now abed and asleep in the room upstairs. The door to the passage was wide open, and the silence became more oppressive than before, strangely and horribly still. Something was not as it had been. Some sound was lacking that must account for the silence. Then Mary realized that she could not hear the clock. The ticking had stopped. She stepped into the passage and listened again. She was right. The house was silent because the clock had stopped. She went forward slowly, with the candle in one hand and the pistol levelled in the other. She turned the corner, where the long, dark passage branched into the hall, and she saw that the clock, which stood always against the wall beside the door into the parlour, had toppled forward and fallen upon its face. The glass was splintered in fragments on the stone flags, and the wood was split. The wall gaped bare where it had stood, very naked now and strange, with the paper marked a deep yellow in contrast to the faded pattern of the wall. The clock had fallen across the narrow hall, and it was not until she came to the foot of the stairs that Mary saw what was beyond. The landlord of Jamaica Inn lay on his face amongst the wreckage. The fallen clock had hidden him at first, for he sprawled in the shadow, one arm flung high above his head, and the other fastened upon the broken, splintered door. Because his legs were stretched out on either side of him, one foot jamming the wainscoting, he looked even larger in death than he did before, his great frame blocking the entrance from wall to wall. There was blood on the stone floor, and blood between his shoulders, dark now and nearly dry, where the knife had found him. When he was stabbed from behind, he must have stretched out his hands and stumbled, dragging at the clock, and when he fell upon his face, the clock crashed with him to the ground, and he died there, clutching at the door. Chapter 15. It was a long while before Mary moved away from the stairs. Something of her own strength had ebbed away, leaving her powerless like the figure on the floor. Her eyes dwelt upon little immaterial things, the fragments of glass from the smashed clock face that were blood-stained too, and the discoloured patch of wall where the clock had stood. A spider settled on her uncle's hand, and it seemed strange to her that the hand stayed motionless and did not seek to rid itself of the spider. Her uncle would have shaken it free. Then it crawled from his hand and ran up his arm, working its way beyond the shoulder. When it came to the wound, it hesitated, and then made a circuit, returning to it again in curiosity, and there was a lack of fear in its rapidity that was somehow horrible and desecrating to death. The spider knew that the landlord could not harm him. Mary knew this too, but she had not lost her fear, like the spider. It was the silence that frightened her most. Now that the clock no longer ticked, her nerves strained for the sound of it. The slow, wheezing choke had been familiar and a symbol of normality. The light of her candle played upon the walls, but it did not reach to the top of the stairs, where the darkness gaped at her like a gulf. She knew she could never climb those stairs again, nor tread that empty landing. Whatever lay beyond her and above must rest there undisturbed. Death had come upon the house tonight, and its brooding spirit still hovered in the air. She felt now that this was what Jamaica Inn had always waited for and feared. The damp walls, the creaking boards, the whispers in the air, and the footsteps that had no name. These were the warnings of a house that had felt itself long threatened. Mary shivered, and she knew that the quality of this silence had origin in far-off, buried and forgotten things. She dreaded panic above all things. The scream that forced itself to the lips, the wild stumble of groping feet and hands that beat the air for passage. She was afraid that it might come to her, destroying reason. And now that the first shock of discovery had lessened, she knew that it might force its way upon her, close in and stifle her. Her fingers might lose their sense of grip and touch, and the candle fall from her hands. Then she would be alone and covered by the darkness. The tearing desire to run seized hold of her, and she conquered it. She backed away from the hall, towards the passage, the candle flickering in the draught of air. And when she came to the kitchen and saw the door still open to the patch of garden, her calm deserted her, and she ran blindly through the door to the cold free air outside, a sob in her throat, her outstretched hands grazing the stone wall as she turned the corner of the house. She ran like a thing pursued across the yard, and came to the open road, where the familiar stalwart figure of the squire's groom confronted her. He put out his hands to save her, and she groped at his belt, feeling for security, her teeth chattering now in the full shock of reaction. He's dead," she said. "He's dead there on the floor. I saw him." And try as she did, she could not stop this chattering of her teeth and the shivering of her body. He led her to the side of the road, back to the trap, and he reached for the cloak and put it around her, and she held it to her close, grateful for the warmth. "He's dead," she repeated. "Stabbed in the back. I saw the place where his coat was rent and there was blood. He lay on his face. The clock had fallen with him. The blood was dry, and he looked as though he'd lain there for some time. The inn was dark and silent. No one else was there." "Was your aunt gone?" whispered the man. Mary shook her head. "I don't know. I did not see. I had to come away." He saw by her face that her strength had gone, and she would fall, and he helped her up into the trap and climbed onto the seat beside her. "All right, then," he said. "All right. Sit quiet, then, here. No one shall hurt you. There, now. All right, then." His gruff voice helped her, and she crouched beside him in the trap, the warm cloak muffled to her chin. "Oh, that was no sight for a maid to see," he told her. "You should have let me go. I wish now you'd have stayed back here in the trap. That's terrible for you to see him lying dead there, murdered." Talking eased her, and his rough sympathy was good. "The pony was still in the stable. I listened at the door and heard him move. They had never even finished their preparations for going. The kitchen door was unlocked, and there were bundles on the floor there, blankets too, ready to load into the cart. It must have happened several hours ago."
Puzzles me what the squire is doing," said Richards. "He should have been here before this. I'd feel easier if he'd come, and you could tell your story to him. There's been bad work here tonight. You should never have come."
They fell silent, and both of them watched the road for the coming of the squire.
"Who'd have killed the landlord?" said Richards. "He's a match for most men, and should have held his own. There was plenty who might have had a hand in it, though, for all that. If ever a man was hated, he was."
"There was the pedlar," said Mary. "I'd forgotten the pedlar. It must have been him breaking out from the barred room."
She fastened upon the idea to escape from another, and she retold the story eagerly now of how the pedlar had come to the inn the night before. It seemed at once that the crime was proven, and that there could be no other explanation.
"Oh, he'll not run far before the squire catches him," said the groom. "You can be sure of that. No one can hide on these moors unless he's a local man, and I've never heard of Harry the pedlar before. But then they came from every hole and corner in Cornwall, just Merlyn's men, by all accounts. They were, as you might say, the dregs of the country."
He paused, and then,
"I'll go to the inn if you'd care for me to, and see for myself if he's left any trace behind him. There might be something."
Mary seized hold of his arm.
"I'll not be alone again. Think me a coward if you will, but I couldn't stand it. Had you been inside Jamaica Inn, you'd understand. There's a brooding quiet about the place tonight that cares nothing for the poor dead body lying there."
"I can mind the time, before your uncle came there, when the house stood empty," said the servant, "and we'd take the dogs there after rats for sport. We thought nothing of it then, just a lonely shell of a place, it seemed, without a soul of its own. But the squire kept it in good repair, mind you, while he waited for a tenant. I'm a St. Neot man myself, and never came here until I served the squire, but I've been told in the old days there was good cheer and good company at Jamaica, with friendly, happy folk living in the house, and always a bed for a passing traveller upon the road. The coaches stayed here then, what never do now, and hounds would meet here once a week in Mr. Bassett's boyhood. Maybe these things will come again."
Mary shook her head.
"I've only seen the evil," she said. "I've only seen the suffering there's been, and the cruelty and the pain. When my uncle came to Jamaica Inn, he must have cast his shadow over the good things, and they died."
Their voices had sunk to a whisper, and they glanced half-consciously over their shoulders to the tall chimneys that stood out against the sky, clear-cut and grey, beneath the moon. They were both thinking of one thing, and neither had the courage to mention it first, the groom from delicacy and tact, Mary from fear alone. Then at last she spoke, her voice husky and low.
"Something has happened to my aunt as well. I know that. I know she is dead. That's why I was afraid to go upstairs. She is lying there in the darkness on the landing above. Whoever killed my uncle will have killed her too."
The groom cleared his throat.
"Well, she may have run out onto the moor. She may have run for help along the road."
"No, she would never have done that. She would be with him now, down in the hall there, crouching by his side. She's dead. I know she's dead. If I had not left her, this would never have happened."
The man was silent. He could not help her. After all, she was a stranger to him, and what had passed beneath the roof of the inn while she had lived there was no concern of his. The responsibility of the evening lay heavy enough upon his shoulders, and he wished that his master would come. Fighting and shouting, he understood, there was sense in that. But if there had really been a murder, as she had said, and the landlord lying dead there, and his wife too, why, they could do no good in staying like fugitives themselves, crouching in the ditch, but were better off and away, and so down the road to sight and sound of human habitation. "I came here by the orders of my mistress," he began. "But she said the squire would be here. Well, seeing as he is not—" Mary held up a warning hand.
"Listen," she said. "Can you hear something?"
They strained their ears to the north. The faint clop of horses was unmistakable, coming from beyond the valley over the brow of the farther hill.
"It's them," said Richards. "It's the squire. He's coming at last. Watch now, we'll see them go down the road into the valley."
They waited, and when a minute had passed, the first horseman appeared like a black smudge against the hard white road, followed by another and another. They strung out in a line, and closed again, travelling at a gallop, while the cob, who waited patiently beside the ditch, pricked his ears and turned an inquiring head. The clatter drew near, and Richards, in his relief, ran out upon the road to greet them, shouting and waving his arms. The leader swerved and drew rein, calling out in surprise at the sight of the groom.
"What the devil do you do here?"
he shouted, for it was the squire himself, and he held up his hand to warn his followers behind.
"The landlord is dead, murdered," cried the groom. "I have his niece here with me in the trap. It was Mrs. Bassett herself who sent me out here, sir. This young woman had best tell you the story in her own words."
He held the horse while his master dismounted, answering as well as he could the rapid questions put to him by the squire, and the little band of men gathered around him too, pressing for news. Some of them dismounting also, and stamping their feet on the ground, blowing upon their hands for warmth.
"If the fellow has been murdered, as you say, then by God it serves him right," said Mr. Bassett. "But I'd rather have clapped irons on him myself, for all that. You can't pay scores against a dead man. Go on into the yard, the rest of you, while I see if I can get some sense out of the girl yonder."
Richards, relieved of responsibility, was surrounded at once and treated as something of a hero, who had not only discovered the murder, but had tackled the author of it single-handed, until he reluctantly admitted that his part in the adventure had been small. The squire, whose mind worked slowly, did not realize what Mary was doing in the trap, and considered her as his groom's prisoner. He heard with astonishment how she had walked the long miles to North Hill in the hopes of finding him, and, not content with that, must return again to Jamaica Inn.
"This is altogether beyond me. I believe you to be in conspiracy with your uncle against the law. Why did you lie to me, then, when I came here earlier in the month? You told me you knew nothing."
"I lied because of my aunt," said Mary, wearily. "Whatever I said to you then was for her sake only, nor did I know as much then as I do now. I am willing to explain everything in a court of law, should it be necessary, but if I tried to tell you now, you would not understand."
"Nor have I the time to listen," replied the squire. "You did a brave thing in walking all that way to Alternan to warn me, and I shall remember it in your favour. But all this trouble could have been avoided, and the terrible crime of Christmas Eve prevented, had you been frank with me before. However, all that for later. My groom tells me that you have found your uncle murdered, but beyond that you know nothing of the crime. Had you been a man, you would go with me now to the inn, but I will spare you that. I can see you have endured enough."
He raised his voice and shouted for the servant.
"Take the trap up to the yard, and stay behind it with the young woman while we break into the inn."
And, turning to Mary,
"I must ask you to wait in the yard, if your courage permits you. You are the only one amongst us who knows anything of the matter, and you were the last to see your uncle alive."
Mary nodded her head. She was nothing more now than a passive instrument of the law, and must do as she was bidden. He had at least spared her the ordeal of going once more into the empty inn and looking upon the body of her uncle. The yard, that had lain in shadow when she came, was now the scene of activity. Horses stamped on the cobblestones, and there was the shaking, ringing sounds of bit and bridle, and there were the footsteps and the voices of the men, topped by the squire's gruff word of command. He led the way round to the back at Mary's direction, and presently the bleak and silent house lost its shuttered air. The window in the bar was flung open, and the windows of the parlour. Some of the men went upstairs and explored the empty guest-rooms above, for these windows were unbarred also, and open to the air. Only the heavy entrance door remained shut, and Mary knew that the landlord's body lay stretched across the threshold. Someone called sharply from the house, and was answered by a murmur of voices and a question from the squire. The sounds came plainly now through the open parlour window to the yard outside. Richards glanced across at Mary, and he saw by the pallor of her face that she had heard. A man who stood by the horses, and who had not gone with the others inside the inn, shouted to the groom.
"Do you hear what they say?"
he said in some excitement.
There's another body there on the landing upstairs.
Richard said nothing. Mary drew her cloak further around her shoulders and pulled the hood across her face. They waited in silence. Presently the squire himself came out into the yard and crossed to the trap.
"I'm sorry," he said. "I have bad news for you. Perhaps you had expected it."
"Yes," said Mary.
"I don't think she suffered at all. She must have died at once. She was lying just inside the bedroom at the end of the passage. Stabbed, like your uncle. She could have known nothing. Believe me, I am very sorry. I wish I could have spared you this."
He stood by her, awkward and distressed, and repeated again that she could not have suffered, that she had not known. And then, seeing that Mary was better left alone, and he could not help her, he stamped back across the yard to the inn. Mary sat motionless, shrouded in her cloak, and she prayed in her own way that Aunt Patience would forgive her and find peace now wherever she should be, and that the dragging chains of life would fall away from her, leaving her free. She prayed also that Aunt Patience would understand what she had tried to do, and above all that her mother would be there, and she would not be alone. These were the only thoughts that brought her a measure of consolation, and she knew if she went over in her mind again the story of the last few hours, she would come to the one and only accusation. Had she not left Jamaica Inn, Aunt Patience might not have died. Once again, though, there came a murmur of excitement from the house, and this time there was shouting and the sound of running feet, and several voices raised in unison, so that Richards ran to the open parlour window, forgetting his trust in the excitement of the moment, and thrust his leg over the sill. There was a crash of splintering wood, and the shutters were torn away from the window of the barred room, which no one apparently had entered up to now. The men were tearing away the barricade of wood, and someone held a flare to light the room. Mary could see the flame dance in the draught of air. Then the light vanished, and the voices died away, and she could hear the sound of footsteps tramping to the back of the house. And then round the corner to the yard they came, 6 or 7 of them, led by the squire, holding amongst them something that squirmed and wriggled and fought for release, with hoarse, bewildered cries.
"They've got him! It's the murderer!"
shouted Richards, calling to Mary. And she turned, brushing aside the hood that covered her face, and looked down upon the group of men who came to the trap. The captive stared up at her, blinking at the light they flashed in his eyes, his clothes cobweb-covered, his face unshaven and black. And it was Harry the peddler.
"Who is he?" they shouted. "Do you know him?"
And the squire came round in front of the trap and bade them bring the man close, so that she could see him well.
"What do you know of this fellow?" he said to Mary. "We found him in the barred room yonder, lying on some sacks, and he denies all knowledge of the crime."
"He was of the company," said Mary. "And he came to the inn last night, and quarrelled with my uncle. My uncle had the better of him and locked him up in the barred room, threatening him with death. He had every reason to kill my uncle, and no one could have done it but he. He is lying to you."
"But the door was locked upon him. It took 3 of us or more to break it down from the outside," said the squire. "This fellow had never been from the room at all. Look at his clothes. Look at his eyes, dazzled still by the light. He's not your murderer."
The peddler glanced furtively from one to the other of his guards, his small, mean eyes darting to right and left, and Mary knew at once that what the squire had said was no more than the truth. Harry the peddler could not have committed the crime. He had lain in the barred room since the landlord put him there over 24 hours ago. He had lain there in the dark, waiting for release, and during the long hours someone had come to Jamaica Inn and gone again, his work completed in the silence of the night.
"Whoever did it knew nothing of this rascal locked in the room yonder," continued the squire. "And he's no use to us as a witness, as far as I can see, for he heard and saw nothing. But we'll have him in jail for all that, and hang him too, if he deserves it, which I'll be bound he does. But he shall turn king's evidence first, and give us the names of his companions. One of them has killed the landlord for revenge, you may depend on that, and we'll track him down if we set every hound in Cornwall on his heels. Take this fellow to the stable, some of you, and hold him there. The rest come back to the inn with me."
They dragged the peddler away, who, realizing that some crime had been discovered and suspicion might possibly rest upon him, found his tongue at last and began to blab his innocence, whining for mercy and swearing by the Trinity, until someone cuffed him to silence and threatened him with the rope there and then, above the stable door. This silenced him, and he fell to muttering blasphemies beneath his breath, turning his rat's eyes now and again to Mary, who sat above him in the trap a few yards away. She waited there, her chin in her hands and the hood fallen away from her face, and she neither heard his blasphemies nor saw his furtive narrow eyes, for she remembered other eyes that had looked upon her in the morning, and another voice that had spoken calm and cold, saying of his brother, "He shall die for this." There was the sentence flung carelessly on the way to Launceston Fair. "I have never killed a man, yet." And there was the gypsy woman in the market square. "There's blood on your hand. You'll kill a man one day." All the little things she would forget rose up again and clamoured against him. His hatred of his brother, his streak of callous cruelty, his lack of tenderness, his tainted Merlyn blood. That, before all things, would betray him first. Like to like, one of a kind. He had gone to Jamaica Inn as he had promised, and his brother had died as he had sworn. The whole truth stared up at her in ugliness and horror, and she wished now that she had stayed and he had killed her too. He was a thief, and like a thief in the night he had come and was gone again. She knew that the evidence could be built against him piece by piece with herself as witness. It would be a fence around him from which there would be no escape. She had only to go now to the squire and say, "I know who it is that has done this thing," and they would listen to her, all of them. They would crowd around her like a pack of hounds panting for the chase, and the trail would lead them to him, past Rushford and through Trewartha Marsh, to 12 Men's Moor. He slept there now, perhaps, forgetful of his crime and caring not at all, stretched on his bed in the lonely cottage where he and his brother had been born. When morning came, he would be gone, whistling perhaps, throwing his legs across a horse, and so away, out of Cornwall forever, a murderer like his father before him. In her fancy she heard the clop of his horse upon the road, far distant in the quiet night, beating a tempo of farewell. But fancy became reason, and reason became certainty, and the sound she heard was not the dream thing of her imagination, but the live tapping of a horse upon the highway. She turned her head and listened, nerves strung now to the limit, and the hands that held the cloak around her were clammy and cold with sweat. The sound of the horse drew nearer still. He was trotting at a steady, even pace, neither hurried nor slow, and the rhythmic, jogging tune that he played on the road had echo in her throbbing heart. She was not alone now as she listened. The men who guarded the peddler murmured to one another in low tones and looked towards the road, and the groom Richards, who was with them, hesitated a moment and then went swiftly to the inn to call the squire. The beat of the horse's hoofs rang loud now as he climbed the hill, sounding like a challenge to the night, so silent and still, and as he topped the summit and rounded the wall into view, the squire came out of the inn, followed by his man.
"Stop!" he called. "In the name of the king! I must ask your business on the road tonight."
The horseman drew rein and turned into the yard. The black riding cape gave no clue to his identity, but when he bowed and bared his head, the thick halo of hair shone white under the moon, and the voice that spoke in answer to the squire was gentle and sweet. "Mr. Bassat of North Hill, I believe," he said, and he leant forward in his saddle with a note in his hand. "I have a message here from Mary Yellan of Jamaica Inn, who asks my help in trouble. But I see by the company assembled here that I have come too late. You remember me, of course. We have met before. I am the Vicar of Alternon." Chapter 16. Mary sat alone in the living-room at the vicarage, and watched the smouldering turf fire. She had slept long, and was now rested and refreshed, but the peace for which she craved had not yet come to her. They had been kind to her, and patient, too kind, perhaps, coming so sudden and unexpected after the long strain. and Mr. Bassett himself, with clumsy, well-meaning hands, patted her on the shoulder as he would a hurt child, and said to her in his gruff, kind way, "Now you must sleep, and forget all you've gone through, and remember it's behind you now and over. I can promise you that we shall find the man who killed your aunt soon, very soon, and he shall hang at the next assizes. And when you are a little recovered from the shock of these last few months, you shall say what you would like to do, and where you would like to go." She had no will of her own. They could make decisions for her. And when Francis Davy offered his home for shelter, she accepted meekly and without feeling, conscious that her listless word of thanks savoured of ingratitude. Once more she knew the humility of being born a woman, when the breaking down of strength and spirit was taken as natural and unquestioned. Were she a man now, she would receive rough treatment or indifference at the best, and be requested to ride at once perhaps to Bodmin or to Launceston to bear witness, with an understanding that she should find her own lodging, and betake herself to the world's end if she wished, when all questions had been asked. And she would depart when they had finished with her, and go on a ship somewhere, working her passage before the mast, or tramp the road with one silver penny in her pocket and her heart and soul at liberty. Here she was, with tears ready to surface and an aching head, being hurried from the scene of action with smooth words and gestures, a nuisance and a factor of delay, like every woman and every child after a tragedy. The vicar had driven her himself in the trap, with the squire's groom following behind on his horse, and he at least had the gift of silence, for he questioned her not at all, nor murmured sympathy to be wasted and ignored, but drove swiftly to Alton and arrived there as his church clock struck 1. He roused his housekeeper from the cottage near by, the same woman that Mary had spoken with in the afternoon, and bade her come with him to the vicarage to prepare a room for his guest, which he did at once, without chattering or exclaiming in wonder, bringing the aired linen from her own home to lay on the bed. She kindled a fire in the grate, and warmed a rough woolen nightdress before it, while Mary shed her clothes, and when the bed was ready for her, and the smooth sheets turned back, Mary allowed herself to be led to it as a child is led to a cradle. She would have closed her eyes at once, but for an arm suddenly around her shoulders, and a voice in her ear. "Drink this," persuasive and cool, and Francis Davy himself stood beside the bed with a glass in his hand, and his strange eyes looking into hers, pale and expressionless. "You will sleep now," he said. And she knew from the bitter taste that he had put some powder in the hot drink which he had brewed for her, and that he had done this in understanding of her restless, tortured mind. The last that she remembered was his hand upon her forehead, and those still white eyes that told her to forget. And then she slept, as he had bidden her. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon before she woke, and the 14 hours of sleep had done the work that he intended, turning the edge of sorrow, and blunting her to pain. The sharp grief for Aunt Patience had softened, and the bitterness too. Reason told her that she could not put the blame upon herself. She had done only what her conscience had commanded her to do. Justice had come first. Her dull wit had not foreseen the tragedy. There lay the fault. There remained regret, and regret could not bring Aunt Patience back again. These were her thoughts on rising, but when she was dressed and had gone below to the living-room, to find the fire burning and the curtains drawn and the vicar abroad upon some business, the old nagging sense of insecurity returned to her, and it seemed to her that responsibility for the disaster lay on her shoulders alone. Jem's face was ever present with her, as she had seen it last, drawn and haggard in the false grey light, and there had been a purpose in his eyes then, and in the very set of his mouth, that she had wilfully ignored. He had been the unknown factor from the beginning to the end, from that first morning when he had come to the bar in Jamaica Inn, and deliberately she had shut her eyes to the truth. She was a woman, and for no reason in heaven or earth she loved him. He had kissed her, and she was bound to him forever. She felt herself fallen and degraded, weakened in mind and body, who had been strong before. And her pride had gone with her independence. One word to the vicar when he returned, and a message to the squire, and Aunt Patience would be avenged. Jem would die with a rope round his neck as his father had done, and she would return to Helford, seeking the threads of her old life that lay twisted even now and buried in the soil. She got up from the chair beside the fire and began to walk the length of the room, with some idea that she wrestled now with her ultimate problem. But even as she did so, she knew that her very action was a lie, a poor trick to appease her conscience, and that the word would never be given. Jem was safe from her, and he would ride away with a song on his lips and a laugh at her expense, forgetful of her, and of his brother, and of God, while she dragged through the years, sullen and bitter, the strain of silence marking her, coming in the end to ridicule as a soured spinster who had been kissed once in her life and could not forget it. Cynicism and sentimentality were two extremes to be avoided, and as Mary prowled about the room, her mind as restless as her body, she felt as though Francis Davy himself was watching her, his cold eyes probing her soul. The room held something of him after all, now that he was not here, and she could imagine him standing in the corner by the easel, his brush in his hand, staring out of the window at things that were dead and gone. There were canvases with their faces to the wall, close to the easel, and Mary turned them to the light in curiosity. Here was an interior of a church, his church, she supposed, painted in the twilight of midsummer, it would seem, with the nave in shadow. There was a strange green afterglow upon the arches stretching to the roof, and this light was something sudden and unexpected that lingered in her memory after she had laid the picture aside, so that she returned to it and considered it once more. It might be that this green afterglow was a faithful reproduction, and peculiar to his church at Alton, but for all that, it cast a haunting and uncanny light upon the picture, and Mary knew that had she a home she would not care for it to hang upon her walls. She could not have put the feeling of discomfort into words, but it was as though some spirit, having no knowledge of the church itself, had groped its way into the interior and breathed an alien atmosphere upon the shadowed nave. As she turned the paintings one by one, she saw that they were all tainted in the same manner and to the same degree. What might have been a striking study of the moor beneath Brown Willie on a spring day, with the high clouds banked up behind the tor, had been marred by the dark colour and the very contour of the clouds that dwarfed the picture and overwhelmed the scene, with this same green light predominating all. She wondered for the first time whether, by being born albino and a freak of nature, his colour sense was therefore in any way impaired, and his sight itself neither normal nor true. This might be the explanation, but even so her feeling of discomfort remained after she had replaced the canvases with their faces to the wall. She continued her inspection of the room, which told her little, it being sparsely furnished anyway, and free of ornaments and books. Even his desk was bare of correspondence, and looked seldom used. She drummed with her fingers on the polished surface, wondering if he sat here to write his sermons. And suddenly and unpardonably she opened the narrow drawer beneath the desk. It was empty, and at once she was ashamed. She was about to shut it, when she noticed that the paper with which the drawer was laid had one corner turned, and there was some sketch drawn upon the other side. She took hold of the paper and glanced at the drawing. Once again, it represented the interior of a church, but this time the congregation was assembled in the pews, and the vicar himself in the pulpit. At first, Mary saw nothing unusual in the sketch. It was a subject natural enough for a vicar to choose who had skill with his pen. But when she looked closer, she realized what he had done. This was not a drawing at all, but a caricature, grotesque as it was horrible. The people of the congregation were bonneted and shawled, and in their best clothes as for Sunday. But he had drawn sheep's heads upon their shoulders, instead of human faces. The animal jaws gaped foolishly at the preacher, with silly vacant solemnity, and their hoofs were folded in prayer. The features of each sheep had been touched upon with care, as though representing a living soul, but the expression on every one of them was the same, that of an idiot who neither knew nor cared. The preacher, with his black gown and halo of hair, was Francis Davy. But he had given himself a wolf's face, and the wolf was laughing at the flock beneath him. The thing was a mockery, blasphemous and terrible. Mary covered it quickly and replaced the paper in the drawer with the white sheet uppermost. Then she shut the drawer and went away from the desk and sat once more in the chair beside the fire. She had stumbled upon a secret, and she would rather that the secret stayed concealed. This was something that concerned her not at all, but rested between the draftsman and his God. When she heard his footstep on the path outside, she rose hurriedly, and moved the light away from her chair so that she would be in shadow when he came into the room, and he could not read her face. Her chair had its back to the door, and she sat there waiting for him. But he was so long in coming that she turned at last to listen for his step, and then she saw him, standing behind her chair, having entered the room noiselessly from the hall. She started in surprise, and he came forward then into the light, making apology for his appearance. "Forgive me," he said. "You did not expect me so soon, and I have blundered into your dreams." She shook her head and stammered an excuse. Then he asked at once after her health and how she had slept, stripping himself of his greatcoat as he spoke, and standing before the fire in his black clerical dress. "Have you eaten today?" he said. And when she told him she had not, he took out his watch and noted the time, a few minutes before 6, which he compared with the clock upon his desk. "You have supped with me before, Mary Yellan, and you shall sup with me again," he said. "But this time, if you do not mind, and if you are rested enough, you shall lay the table and fetch the tray from the kitchen. Hannah will have left it prepared, and we will not trouble her again. For my part, I have writing to do, that is, if you have no objection." She assured him that she was rested and would like nothing better than to make herself useful, and he nodded his head then and said, "At 7:15, turning his back on her, and she gathered she was dismissed. She made her way to the kitchen, put something out of countenance at his abrupt arrival, and she was glad that he had given her an added half-hour to herself, for she had been ill-prepared for conversation when he found her. Perhaps supper would be a brief affair, and once over he would turn to his desk again and leave her to her thoughts. She wished she had not opened the drawer. The memory of the caricature lingered with her unpleasantly. She felt much as a child does who acquires knowledge forbidden by his parents, and then hangs his head, guilty and ashamed, fearful that his tongue will betray him. She would have been more comfortable could she have taken her meal alone here in the kitchen and been treated by him as a handmaid rather than a guest. As it was, her position was not defined, for his courtesy and his commands were curiously mingled. She made play, then, of getting the supper at home among the familiar kitchen smells, and awaited reluctantly the summons of the clock. Church itself chimed the 3/4, and gave her no excuse, so she carried the tray to the living-room, hoping that nothing of her inner feeling showed upon her face. He was standing with his back to the fire, and he had pulled the table in readiness before it. Although she did not look at him, she felt his scrutiny upon her, and her movements were clumsy. She was aware, too, that he had made some alteration to the room, and out of the tail of her eye she saw that he had taken down his easel, and the canvases were no longer stacked against the wall. The desk, for the first time, was in disorder, with papers and correspondence piled upon it, and he had been burning letters, too, for the yellow blackened scraps lay amongst the ashes under the turf. They sat down together at the table, and he helped her to the cold pie. "Is curiosity dead in Mary Yellan that she does not ask me what I have done with my day?" he said at length, mocking her gently, and bringing the flush of guilt to her face at once. "'Tis no business of mine where you have been," she answered. "You are wrong there," he said, "and it is your business. I have meddled in your affairs the livelong day. You asked for my help, did you not?" Mary was ashamed, and hardly knew what to reply. "I have not thanked you yet for coming so promptly to Jamaica Inn," she said, "nor for my bed last night and my sleep today. You think me ungrateful." "I never said that. I wondered only at your patience. It had not struck 2 when I bade you sleep this morning, and it is now 7 in the evening. Long hours, and things do not stand still by themselves.
Did you not sleep then after you left me?
I slept until 8, and then I breakfasted and was away again. My grey horse was lame, and I could not use him, so progress was slow with the cob. He jogged like a snail to Jamaica Inn, and from Jamaica Inn to North Hill.
You have been to North Hill?
Mr. Bassett entertained me to luncheon. There were 8 or 10 of us present, I dare say, and each one of us shouting his opinion to the deaf ear of his neighbour. It was a lengthy meal, and I was glad when we came to the end of it. However, we were all of one accord that the murderer of your uncle will not remain at liberty for long.
Does Mr. Bassett suspect anyone?
Mary's tone was guarded, and she kept her eyes on her plate. The food tasted like sawdust in her mouth. Mr. Bassett is ready to suspect himself. He has questioned every inhabitant within a radius of 10 miles, and the number of strange persons who were abroad last night is legion. It will take a week or more to have the truth from every one of them, but no matter, Mr. Bassett is not deterred.
What have they done with my aunt?
They were taken, both of them, to North Hill this morning, and are to be buried there. All that has been arranged, and you need not concern yourself. As for the rest, well, we shall see.
And the peddler? They have not let him go.
No, he is safe under lock and key, screaming curses to the air. I do not care for the peddler. Neither, I think, do you. Mary laid aside the fork she had lifted to her lips, and put down the meat again untasted.
How do you mean?
She said, on the defensive. I repeat, you do not care for the peddler. I can well understand it, for a more unpleasant and disagreeable fellow I have never clapped eyes on. I gather from Richard's groom to Mr. Bassett that you suspected the peddler of the murder and said as much to Mr. Bassett himself. Hence my conclusion that you do not care for him. It is a pity for all of us that that barred room proves him innocent. He would have made an excellent scapegoat and saved a deal of trouble. The vicar continued to make an excellent supper, but Mary was only playing with her food, and when he offered her a second helping she refused. "What has the peddler done to incur your displeasure to such an extent?" he inquired, harping upon the subject with persistence.
"He attacked me once."
"Ah, I thought as much. He is true to a particular type. You resisted him, of course."
I believe I hurt him. He did not touch me again."
"No, I do not suppose he did. When did this happen?"
"On Christmas Eve."
"After I left you at 5 Lanes?"
"Yes."
"I am beginning to understand. You did not return, then, to the inn that night? You fell in with the landlord and his friends upon the road?"
"Yes."
"And they took you with them to the shore to add to their sport?"
"Please, Mr. Davy, do not ask me any more. I would rather not speak of that night, neither here nor in the future, not ever again. There are some things that are best buried deep."
"You shall not speak of it, Mary Yellan. I blame myself for having allowed you to continue your journey alone. Looking at you now with your clear eye and skin, and the way you carry your head, and above all the set of your chin, you bear little trace of what you endured. The word of a parish priest may not go for much, but you have shown remarkable fortitude. I admire you." She looked up at him, and then away again, and fell to crumbling a piece of bread in her hand. "When I consider the peddler," he continued after a while, helping himself generously to stewed damsons, "I feel it very remiss of the murderer not to have looked into the barred room. It may have been that he was pressed for time, but a minute or two could hardly have affected the issue, and he would most certainly have made the whole affair more thorough."
"In what way, Mr. Davy?"
"Why, by putting paid to the peddler's account."
You mean he might have killed him too?"
"Precisely. The peddler is no ornament to the world while he lives, and dead he would at least make food for worms. That is my opinion. What is more, had the murderer known that the peddler had attacked you, he would have had a motive strong enough to kill twice over." Mary cut herself a slice of cake she did not want, and forced it between her lips. By making a pretence of eating, she gave herself countenance. The hand shook, though, that held the knife, and she made a poor job of her slice. "I don't see," she said, "what I have to do in the matter." "You have too modest an opinion of yourself," he replied. They continued to eat in silence, Mary with lowered head and eyes firm fixed upon her plate. Instinct told her that he played her as an angler plays the fish upon his line. At last she could wait no longer, but must blurt him a question. "So Mr. Bassett and the rest of you have made little headway after all, and the murderer is still at large?"
Oh, but we have not moved as slowly as that. Some progress has been made. The peddler, for instance, in a hopeless attempt to save his own skin, has turned King's evidence to the best of his ability, but he has not helped us much. We have had from him a bald account of the work done on the coast on Christmas Eve, in which, he says, he took no part, and also some patching together of the long months that have gone before. We heard of the wagons that came to Jamaica Inn by night, among other things, and we were given the names of his companions. Those he knew, that is to say. The organization appears to have been far larger than was hitherto supposed. Mary said nothing. She shook her head when he offered her the damsons. "In fact," continued the vicar, "he went so far as to suggest that the landlord of Jamaica Inn was their leader in name only, and that your uncle had his orders from one above him. That, of course, puts a new complexion on the matter. The gentleman became excited and a little disturbed. What have you to say of the peddler's theory?"
"It is possible, of course."
"I believe you once made the same suggestion to me."
"I may have done, I forget."
"If this is so, it would seem that the unknown leader and the murderer must be one and the same person. Don't you agree?"
"Why, yes, I suppose so."
"That should narrow the field considerably. We may disregard the general rabble of the company and look for someone with a brain and a personality. Did you ever see such a person at Jamaica Inn?"
"No, never."
"He must have gone to and fro in stealth, possibly in the silence of the night, when you and your aunt were abed and asleep. He would not have come by the high road because you would have heard the clatter of his horse's hoofs. But there is always the possibility that he came on foot, is there not?"
"Yes, there is always that possibility, as you say."
"In which case the man must know the moors, or at least have local knowledge. One of the gentlemen suggested that he lived nearby, within walking or riding distance, that is to say. And that is why Mr. Bassett intends to question every inhabitant in the radius of 10 miles, as I explained to you at the beginning of supper. So you see, the net will close around the murderer, and if he tarries long, he will be caught. We are all convinced of that."
"Oh, have you finished already? You have eaten very little." I am not hungry."
"I am sorry for that. Hannah will think her cold pie was not appreciated." "Did I tell you I saw an acquaintance of yours today?"
"No, you did not. I have no friends but yourself."
"Thank you, Mary Yellan. That is a pretty compliment, and I shall treasure it accordingly. But you are not being strictly truthful, you know. You have an acquaintance. You told me so yourself."
I don't know who you mean, Mr. Davy."
"Oh, come now. Did not the landlord's brother take you to Launceston Fair?"
Mary gripped her hands under the table and dug her nails into her flesh. The landlord's brother," she repeated, playing for time. I have not seen him since then. I believed him to be away."
"No, he has been in the district since Christmas. He told me so himself. As a matter of fact, it had come to his ears that I had given you shelter, and he came up to me with a message for you. 'Tell her how sorry I am.' That is what he said. I presume he referred to your aunt."
"Was that all he said?"
"I believe he would have said more, but Mr. Bassett interrupted us."
"Mr. Bassett? Mr. Bassett was there when he spoke to you?"
"Why, of course. There were several of the gentlemen in the room.
It was just before I came away from North Hill this evening, when the discussion was closed for the day.
Why was Jem Merlyn present at the discussion?
He had a right, I suppose, as brother of the deceased. He did not appear much moved by his loss, but perhaps they did not agree.
Did Mr. Bassett and the gentleman question him?
There was a considerable amount of talk amongst them the whole day. Young Merlyn appears to possess intelligence. His answers were most astute. He must have a far better brain than his brother ever had. You told me he lived somewhat precariously, I remember. He stole horses, I believe. Mary nodded. Her fingers traced a pattern on the tablecloth. He seems to have done that when there was nothing better to do, said the vicar. But when a chance came for him to use his intelligence, he took it, and small blame to him, I suppose. No doubt he was well paid. The gentle voice wore away at her nerves, pin-pricking them with every word, and she knew now that he had defeated her, and she could no longer keep up the pretence of indifference. She lifted her face to him, her eyes heavy with the agony of restraint, and she spread out her hands in supplication.
What will they do to him, Mr. Davy? What will they do to him?
The pale, expressionless eyes stared back at her, and for the first time she saw a shadow pass across them, and a flicker of surprise. "Do?" he said, obviously puzzled. "Why should they do anything? I suppose he has made his peace with Mr. Bassett and has nothing more to fear. They will hardly throw old sins in his face after the service he has done them."
"I don't understand you. What service has he done?"
"Your mind works slowly tonight, Mary Yellan, and I appear to talk in riddles. Did you not know that it was Jem Merlyn who informed against his brother?" She stared at him stupidly, her brain clogged and refusing to work. She repeated the words after him like a child who learns a lesson.
"Jem Merlyn informed against his brother?"
The vicar pushed away his plate and began to set the things in order on the tray. "Why, certainly," he said. "So Mr. Bassett gave me to understand. It appears that it was the squire himself who fell in with your friend at Launceston on Christmas Eve and carried him off to North Hill as an experiment. 'You've stolen my horse,' said he, 'and you're as big a rogue as your brother. I've the power to clap you in jail tomorrow, and you wouldn't set eyes on a horse for a dozen years or more. But you can go free if you bring me proof that your brother at Jamaica Inn is the man I believe him to be.' Your young friend asked for time, and when the time was up he shook his head. 'No,' said he, 'you must catch him yourself if you want him. I'm damned if I'll have truck with the law.' But the squire pushed a proclamation under his nose. 'Look there, Jem,' he said, 'and see what you think of that. There's been the bloodiest wreck on Christmas Eve since the Lady of Gloucester went ashore above Padstow last winter. Now, will you change your mind?' As to the rest of the story, the squire said little in my hearing. People were coming and going all the time, you must remember. But I gather your friend slipped his chain and ran for it in the night, and then came back again yesterday morning when they thought to have seen the last of him, and went straight to the squire as he came out of church and said, as cool as you please, 'Very well, Mr. Bassett, you shall have your proof.' And that is why I remarked to you just now that Jem Merlyn had a better brain than his brother." The vicar had cleared the table and set the tray in the corner, but he continued to stretch his legs before the fire and take his ease in the narrow, high-backed chair. Mary took no account of his movements. She stared before her into space, her whole mind split, as it were, by his information, the evidence she had so fearfully and so painfully built against the man she loved, collapsing into nothing like a pack of cards.
"Mr. Davy," she said, "I believe I am the biggest fool that ever came out of Cornwall."
"I believe you are, Mary Yellan," said the vicar. His dry tone, so cutting after the gentle voice she knew, was a rebuke in itself, and she accepted it with humility.
Whatever happens, I can face the future now bravely and without shame.
I am glad of that, he said. She shook her hair from her face and smiled for the first time since he had known her. The anxiety and the dread had gone from her at last.
"What else did Jem Merlyn say and do?" she asked.
The vicar glanced at his watch and replaced it with a sigh. "I wish I had the time to tell you," he said. "But it is nearly 8 already. The hours go by too fast for both of us. I think we have talked enough about Jem Merlyn for the present."
"Tell me one thing. Was he at North Hill when you left?"
"He was. In fact, it was his last remark that hurried me home."
"What did he say to you?"
"He did not address himself to me. He announced his intention of riding over tonight to visit the blacksmith at Warlegan."
"Mr. Davy, you're playing with me now."
"I most certainly am not. Warlegan is a long trek from North Hill, but I dare say he can find his way in the dark."
"What has it to do with you if he visits the blacksmith?"
"He will show the nail he picked up in the heather down in the field below Jamaica Inn. The nail comes from a horse's shoe. The job was carelessly done, of course. The nail was a new one, and Jem Merlyn, being a stealer of horses, knows the work of every blacksmith on the moors. Look here," he said to the squire. "I found it this morning in the field behind the inn. Now you've had your discussions and want me no more, I'll ride to Warlegan, with your leave, and throw this in Tom Jory's face as bad workmanship."
"Well, and what then?" said Mary.
"Yesterday was Sunday, was it not? And on Sunday no blacksmith plies his trade, unless he has great respect for his customer. Only one traveller passed Tom Jory's smithy yesterday, and begged a new nail for his lame horse, and the time was, I suppose, somewhere near 7 o'clock in the evening, after which the traveller continued his journey by way of Jamaica Inn."
"How do you know this?"
said Mary. "Because the traveller was the vicar of Alternan," he said. Chapter 17. A silence had fallen upon the room. Although the fire burnt steady as ever, there was a chill in the air that had not been there before. Each waited for the other to speak, and Mary heard Francis Davy swallow once. At length she looked into his face and saw what she expected. The pale, steadfast eyes staring at her across the table, cold no longer, but burning in the white mask of his face like living things at last. She knew now what he would have her know. But still she said nothing. She clung to ignorance as a source of protection, playing for time as the only ally in her favour. His eyes compelled her to speak, and she continued to warm her hands at the fire, forcing a smile.
"You're pleased to be mysterious tonight, Mr. Davy?"
He did not answer at once. She heard him swallow again, and then he leant forward in his chair with an abrupt change of subject. "You lost your confidence in me today, before I came," he said. "You went to my desk and found the drawing. You were disturbed. No, I did not see you. I am no keyhole watcher. But I saw that the paper had been moved. You said to yourself, as you have said before, 'What manner of man is this vicar of Alternan?' And when you heard my footsteps on the path, you crouched in your chair there before the fire, rather than look upon my face. Don't shrink from me, Mary Yellan. There is no longer any need for pretense between us, and we can be frank with one another, you and I." Mary turned to him, and then away again. There was a message in his eyes she feared to read.
"I am very sorry I went to your desk. Such an action was unforgivable, and I don't yet know how I came to it. As for the drawing, I am ignorant of such things, and whether it be good or bad, I cannot say."
"Never mind if it be good or bad. The point was that it frightened you."
"Yes, Mr. Davy, it did."
"You said to yourself again, 'This man is a freak of nature, and his world is not my world.' You were right there, Mary Yellan. I live in the past, when men were not so humble as they are today. Oh, not your hearers of history in doublet and hose and narrow-pointed shoes, They were never my friends, but long ago, in the beginning of time, when the rivers and the sea were one, and the old gods walked the hills. He rose from his chair and stood before the fire, a lean black figure with white hair and eyes, and his voice was gentle now as she had known it first. "Were you a student, you would understand," he said. "But you are a woman, living already in the 19th century, and because of this my language is strange to you. Yes, I am a freak in nature, and a freak in time. I do not belong here, and I was born with a grudge against the age, and a grudge against mankind. Peace is very hard to find in the 19th century. The silence is gone, even on the hills. I thought to find it in the Christian church, but the dogma sickened me, and the whole foundation is built upon a fairy tale. Christ himself is a figurehead, a puppet thing created by man himself. However, we can talk of these things later, when the heat and turmoil of pursuit is not upon us. We have eternity before us. One thing at least, we have no traps or baggage, but can travel light as they travelled of old." Mary looked up at him, her hands gripping the sides of her chair. "I don't understand you, Mr. Davy." "Why, yes, you understand me very well. You know by now that I killed the landlord of Jamaica Inn, and his wife, too. Nor would the peddler have lived had I known of his existence. You have pieced the story together in your mind while I talked to you just now. You know that it was I who directed every move made by your uncle, and that he was a leader in name alone. I have sat here at night with him in your chair there, and the map of Cornwall spread out on the table before us. Jos Merlyn, the terror of the countryside, twisting his hat in his hands, and touching his forelock when I spoke to him. He was like a child in the game, powerless without my orders, a poor blustering bully that hardly knew his right hand from his left. His vanity was like a bond between us, and the greater his notoriety amongst his companions, the better was he pleased. We were successful, and he served me well. No other man knew the secret of our partnership. You were the block, Mary Yellan, against which we stubbed our toes. With your wide inquiring eyes and your gallant inquisitive head, you came amongst us, and I knew that the end was near. In any case, we had played the game to its limit, and the time had come to make an end. How you pestered me with your courage and your conscience, and how I admired you for it. Of course, you must hear me in the empty guest room at the inn, and must creep down to the kitchen and see the rope upon the beam. That was your first challenge. And then you steal out upon the moor after your uncle, who had tryst with me on Rough Tor, and losing him in the darkness, stumble upon myself, and make me confident. Well, I became your friend, did I not, and gave you good advice, which, believe me, could not have been bettered by a magistrate himself. Your uncle knew nothing of our strange alliance, nor would he have understood. He brought his own death upon himself by disobedience. I knew something of your determination, and that you would betray him at the first excuse. Therefore he should give you none, and time alone would quiet your suspicions. But your uncle must drink himself to madness on Christmas Eve, and blundering like a savage and a fool, set the whole country in a blaze. I knew then he had betrayed himself, and with the rope around his neck would play his last card and name me master. Therefore he had to die, Mary Yellan, and your aunt, who was his shadow. And had you been at Jamaica Inn last night when I passed by, you too. No, you would not have died. He leant down to her, and taking her two hands he pulled her to her feet so that she stood level with him, looking in his eyes. No, he repeated, you would not have died. You would have come with me then, as you will come tonight. She stared back at him, watching his eyes. They told her nothing. They were clear and cold as they had been before. But his grip upon her wrists was firm and held no promise of release.
"You are wrong," she said. "You would have killed me then as you will kill me now. I am not coming with you, Mr. Davy."
"Death to dishonour," he said, smiling, the thin line breaking the mask of his face. "I face you with no such problem. You have gained your knowledge of the world from old books, Mary, where the bad man wears a tail beneath his cloak and breathes fire through his nostrils. You have proved yourself a dangerous opponent, and I prefer you by my side. There, that is a tribute. You are young, and you have a certain grace which I should hate to destroy. Besides, in time we will take up the threads of our first friendship, which has gone astray tonight."
"You are right to treat me as a child and a fool, Mr. Davy. I have been both since I stumbled against your horse that November evening. Any friendship we may have shared was a mockery and a dishonour, and you gave me counsel with the blood of an innocent man scarce dry upon your hands. My uncle at least was honest. Drunk or sober, he blurted his crimes to the four winds, and dreamt of them by night to his terror. But you wear the garments of a priest of God to shield you from suspicion. You hide behind the cross. You talk to me of friendship?"
"Your revolt and your disgust please me the more, Mary Yellan. There is a dash of fire about you that the women of old possessed. Your companionship is not a thing to be thrown aside. Come, let us leave religion out of our discussion. When you know me better, we will return to it, and I will tell you how I sought refuge from myself in Christianity, and found it to be built upon hatred and jealousy and greed, all the man-made attributes of civilization, while the old pagan barbarism was naked and clean. I have had my soul sickened. Poor Mary, with your feet fast in the 19th century, and your bewildered fawn face looking up to mine, who admit myself a freak of nature and a shame upon your little world. Are you ready? Your cloak hangs in the hall, and I am waiting." She backed to the wall, her eyes upon the clock, but he still held her wrists and tightened his grip upon them. "Understand me," he said. "The house is empty. You know that, and the pitiful vulgarity of screams would be heard by no one. The good Hannah is in her cottage by her own fireside, the other side of the church. I am stronger than you would suppose. Poor white ferret looks frail enough and misleads you, doesn't he? But your uncle knew my strength. I don't want to hurt you, Mary Yellan, or spoil that trace of beauty you possess for the sake of quiet, but that I shall have to do if you withstand me. Come, where is that spirit of adventure which you have made your own? Where is your courage and your gallantry?" He saw by the clock that he must have overstepped already his margin of time, and had little in reserve. He concealed his impatience well, but it was there, in the flicker of his eye and the tightening of his lips. It was 8:30, and by now Jem would have spoken with the blacksmith at Warlegan. 12 miles lay between them, perhaps, but no more. And Jem was not the fool that Mary herself had been. She thought rapidly, weighing the chances of failure and success. If she went now with Francis Davy, she would be a drag upon him, and a brake on his speed. That was inevitable, and he must have gambled upon it. The chase would follow hard upon his heels, and her presence would betray him in the end. Should she refuse to go, why, then there would be a knife in her heart at best, for he would not encumber himself with a wounded companion, for all his flattery. Gallant, he had called her, and possessed with the spirit of adventure. Well, he should see what distance her courage took her, and that she could gamble with her life as well as he. If he were insane, and this she believed him to be, why, then his insanity would bring about his destruction. If he were not mad, she would be that same stumbling block she had been to him from the beginning, with her girl's wits matched against his brains. She had the right upon her side, and faith in God, and he was an outcast in a hell of his own creation. She smiled then, and looked into his eyes, having made her decision. "I'll come with you, Mr. Davy. But you'll find me a thorn in the flesh and a stone in your path. You will regret it in the end." "Come as enemy or friend, that does not matter to me," he told her.
You shall be the millstone round my neck, and I'll like you the better for it. You'll soon cast your mannerisms aside, and all your poor trappings of civilization that you sucked into your system as a child. I'll teach you to live, Mary Yellan, as men and women have not lived for 4,000 years or more.
You'll find me no companion on your road, Mr. Davy.
Roads? Who spoke of roads? We go by the moors and the hills, and tread granite and heather as the Druids did before us.
She could have laughed in his face. But he turned to the door and held it open for her, and she bowed to him, mocking, as she passed into the passage. She was filled with the wild spirit of adventure, and she had no fear of him, and no fear of the night. Nothing mattered now, because the man she loved was free, and had no stain of blood upon him. She could love him without shame, and cry it aloud had she the mind. She knew what he had done for her, and that he would come to her again. In fancy she heard him ride upon the road in their pursuit, and she heard his challenge and his triumphant cry. She followed Francis Davy to the stable where the horses were saddled, and this was a sight for which he was ill-prepared.
Do you not mean to take the trap?" she said.
"Are you not great enough encumbrance already without further baggage?" he replied. "No, Mary, we must travel light and free. You can ride, every woman born in a farm can ride, and I shall hold your rein. Speed I cannot promise you, alas, for the cob has been worked today, and will begrudge us more. As for the grey, he is lame, as you know, and will make poor mileage for us. Ah, restless, this departure is half your fault, did you but know it. When you cast your nail in the heather, you betrayed your master. You must carry a woman on your back as penance." The night was dark, with a raw dampness in the air and a chill wind. The sky was overcast with low-flying cloud, and the moon was blotted out. There would be no light upon the way, and the horses would travel unseen. It seemed as though the first cast was against Mary, and the night itself favoured the vicar of Aldernon. She climbed into the saddle, wondering whether a shout and a wild cry for help would rouse the sleeping village. But even as the thought flashed through her mind, she felt his hand upon her foot, placing it in the stirrup. And looking down upon him, she saw the gleam of steel beneath his cape, and he lifted his head and smiled. "That were a fool's trick, Mary," he said. "They go to bed early in Aldernon, and by the time they were astir and rubbing their eyes, I should be away on the moor yonder, and you would be lying on your face, with the long wet grass for pillow, and your youth and beauty spoilt. Come now, if your hands and feet are cold, the ride will warm them, and restless will carry you well." She said nothing, but took the reins in her hands. She had gone too far now in her game of chance, and must play it to the finish. He mounted the bay cob, with the grey attached to him by a leading rein, and they set out upon their fantastic journey like two pilgrims. As they passed the silent church, shadowed and enclosed, and left it behind them, the vicar flourished his black shovel hat and bared his head. "You should have heard me preach," he said. "They sat there in the stalls like sheep, even as I drew them, with their mouths agape and their souls asleep. The church was a roof above their heads with 4 walls of stone, and because it had been blessed at the beginning by human hands, they thought it holy. They do not know that beneath the foundation stone lie the bones of their pagan ancestors, and the old granite altars where sacrifice was held long before Christ died upon his cross. I have stood in the church at midnight, Mary, and listened to the silence. There is a murmur in the air and a whisper of unrest that is bred deep in the soil and has no knowledge of the church and Aldernon." His words found echo in her mind, and carried her away back to the dark passage at Jamaica Inn. She remembered how she had stood there with her uncle dead upon the ground, and there was a sense of horror and fear about the walls that was born of an old cause. His death was nothing, was only a repetition of what had been before, long ago in time, when the hill where Jamaica stood today was bare but for heather and stone. She remembered how she had shivered, as though touched by a cold, inhuman hand. And she shivered now, looking at Francis Davy with his white hair and eyes that had looked upon the past. They came to the fringe of moor, and the rough track leading to the ford,
and then beyond this and across the stream to the great black heart of the moor, where there were no tracks and no paths, but only the coarse tufted grass and the dead heather. Ever and again the horses stumbled on the stones, or sank in the soft ground bordering the marshes. But Francis Davy found his way like a hawk in the air, hovering an instant and brooding upon the grass beneath him, then swerving again and plunging to the hard ground.
"You know as well as I do that I shall run from you at the first chance, and at the first village, perhaps. I came with you tonight because you would have killed me otherwise. But in daylight, within sight and sound of men and women, you will be as perilous as I am now."
"As you will, Mary Yellan. I am prepared for the risk. You forget, in your happy confidence, that the north coast of Cornwall bears no relation to the south. You come from Helford, you told me, where the pleasant lanes wind by the side of the river, and where your villages touch one another, string upon string, and there are cottages upon the road. This north coast is hardly so hospitable as you will find. It is as lonely and untravelled as these moors themselves, and never a man's face shall you look upon but mine until we come to the haven that I have in mind."
"Let me grant you that, then,"
said Mary, with a bluster born of fear.
"Let me grant even that the sea is reached, and we upon your waiting ship with the coast behind us. Name any country as you please, Africa or Spain, and do you think that I should follow you there, and not expose you a murderer of men?"
"You will have forgotten it by then, Mary Yellan."
"Forgotten that you killed my mother's sister?"
"Yes, and more besides. Forgotten the moors and Jamaica Inn, and your own little blundering feet that stumbled across my path. Forgotten your tears on the high road from Launceston, and the young man who caused them."
"You are pleased to be personal, Mr. Davy."
"I am pleased to have touched you on the raw. Oh, don't bite your lip and frown. I can guess your thoughts. I told you before, I've heard confessions in my day, and I know the dreams of women better than you do yourself. There I have the advantage of the landlord's brother."
He smiled again, the thin line breaking in his face, and she turned away so that she could not see the eyes that degraded her. They rode on in silence, and after a while it seemed to Mary that the darkness of the night became intensified, and the air closer, nor could she see the hills around her as she had before. The horses picked their way delicately, and now and again stopped in their tracks and snorted as though in fear, uncertain of their steps. The ground was soggy now and treacherous, and though Mary could no longer see the land on either side, she knew by the feel of the soft, yielding grass that they were encompassed by marshes. This accounted for the horse's fear, and she glanced at her companion to discover his mood. He leant forward in his saddle, straining his eyes to the darkness that every moment became thicker and harder to penetrate, and she saw by his tense profile and his thin mouth tight closed like a trap that he was concentrating every nerve upon their passage, fraught suddenly with a new danger. The nervousness of her horse communicated itself to the rider, and Mary thought of these same marshes as she had seen them in the broad light of day, the brown tufted grass swaying to the wind, and beyond the tall thin reeds quivering and rustling at the merest breath, crowded together and moving as one force, while beneath them the black water waited in silence. She knew how the people of the moors themselves could go astray and falter in their step, so that he who walked with confidence one moment could stumble the next and sink without warning. Francis Davy knew the moors, but even he was not infallible and might lose his way. A brook burbled and made song. A brook could be heard running over stones for a mile or more, but the water of the marshes made no sound. The first slip could be the last. Her nerves were strung to expectation, and half-consciously she made preparations to fling herself from the saddle should her horse stagger suddenly, and with sickening plunge grope like a blind thing in the strangling weeds. She heard her companion swallow, and the little trick put an edge upon her fear. He peered to right and left, his hat in his hand to better his sight, and already the moisture glistened in his hair and clung to his garments. Mary watched the damp mist rise from the low ground. She smelt the sour and rotting tang of reeds, and then in front of them, barring their further progress, rolled a great bank of fog out of the night, a white wall that stifled every scent and sound. Francis Davy drew rein. The two horses obeyed him instantly, trembling and snorting, the steam from their flanks merging with the mist. They waited a while, for a moorland fog can roll away as suddenly as it comes. But this time there was no thin clearing of the air, and no dissolving threads. It hung about them like a spider's web. Then Francis Davy turned to Mary. Like a ghost he looked beside her, with the fog on his lashes and in his hair, and his white mask face as inscrutable as ever. "The gods have gone against me after all," he said. "I know these fogs of old, and this one will not lift for several hours. To continue now amongst the marshes would be worse madness than to return. We must wait for the dawn." She said nothing, her first hopes returning to her again. But even as the thought came to her, she remembered that fog baffled pursuit, and was an enemy to the hunter as well as the hunted. "Where are we?" she asked. And as she spoke he took her rein once more, and urged the horses to the left, away from the low ground, until the yielding grass gave place to firmer heather and loose stones, while the white fog moved with them step by step. "There will be rest for you after all, Mary Yellan, and a cave for your shelter and granite for your bed. Tomorrow may bring the world to you again, but tonight you shall sleep on rough tor." The horses bent to the strain, and they climbed slowly and ponderously out of the mist to the black hills beyond. Later, Mary sat shrouded in her cloak like a phantom figure, with her back against a hollow stone. Her knees were drawn to her chin, with her arms clasped tight around them, but even so the raw air found its way between the folds of her cloak and lapped her skin. The great jagged summit of the tor lifted its face to the sky like a crown above the mist, and below them the clouds hung solid and unchanged, a massive wall defying penetration. The air was pure here, and crystal clear, disdaining knowledge of the world below, where living things must grope and stumble in the mist. There was a wind here that whispered in the stones and stirred the heather. There was a breath, keen as a knife and cold, that blew upon the surface of the altar slabs and echoed in the caves. These sounds mingled with one another and became like a little clamour in the air. Then they would droop again and fall away, and an old, dead silence come upon the place. The horses stood against a boulder for shelter, their heads together for company. But even they were restless and uneasy, turning now and again towards their master. He sat apart, a few yards distant from his companion, and sometimes she felt his eyes upon her in consideration, weighing the chances of success. She was ever watchful, ever ready for attack, and when he moved suddenly or turned upon his slab of stone, her hands unclasped themselves from her knees and waited, her fists clenched. He had bade her sleep, but sleep would never come to her tonight. Should it creep to her insidiously, she would fight against it, beat it away with her hands and strive to overcome it, even as she must overcome her enemy. She knew that sleep might take her suddenly before she was aware, and later she would wake with the touch of his cold hands upon her throat and his pale face above her. She would see the short white hair frame his face like a halo, and the still, expressionless eyes glow with a light that she had known before. This was his kingdom here, alone in the silence, with the great twisted peaks of granite to shield him and the white mist below to shroud him. Once she heard him clear his throat, as though to speak, and she thought how far removed they were from any sphere of life, two beings flung together in eternity, and that this was a nightmare with no day to follow it, so that soon she must lose herself and merge into his shadow. He said nothing, and out of the silence came the whisper of the wind again. It rose and fell, making a moan upon the stones. This was a new wind, with a sob and a cry behind it, a wind that came from nowhere, bound from no shore. It rose from the stones themselves, and from the earth beneath the stones. It sang in the hollow caves and in the crevices of rock, at first a sigh, and then a lamentation. It played upon the air like a chorus from the dead. Mary drew her cloak around her, and pulled the hood about her ears to muffle the sound. But even as she did so, the wind increased, tugging at her hair, and a little ripple of draught ran screaming to the cave behind her. There was no source to the disturbance, for below the tor the heavy fog clung to the ground, obstinate as ever, with never a breath of air to roll away the clouds. Here on the summit the wind fretted and wept, whispering of fear, sobbing old memories of bloodshed and despair, and there was a wild lost note that echoed in the granite high above Mary's head, on the very peak of Rough Tor, as though the gods themselves stood there with their great heads lifted to the sky. In her fancy she could hear the whisper of 1,000 voices, and the tramping of 1,000 feet, and she could see the stones turning to men beside her. Their faces were inhuman, older than time, carved and rugged like the granite, and they spoke in a tongue she could not understand, and their hands and feet were curved like the claws of a bird. They turned their stone eyes upon her, and looked through her and beyond, heeding her not, and she knew she was like a leaf in the wind, tossed hither and thither to no ultimate purpose, while they lived and endured, monsters of antiquity. They came towards her, shoulder to shoulder, neither seeing nor hearing her, but moving like blind things to her destruction. And she cried suddenly and started to her feet, every nerve in her body throbbing and alive. The wind dropped, and was no more than a breath upon her hair. Slabs of granite stood beyond her, dark and immobile, as they had done before, and Francis Davy watched her, his chin upon his hands. "You fell asleep," he said, and she told him no, doubting her own statement, her mind still grappling with the dream that was no dream. "You are tired, yet you persist in watching for the dawn. It is barely midnight now, and there are long hours to wait. Give way to nature, Mary Yellan, and relax. Do you think I want to harm you?" "I think nothing, but I cannot sleep." "You're chilled, crouched there in your cloak, with a stone behind your head. I am little better myself, but there is no draught here from a crevice in the rock. We would do well if we gave our warmth to one another." "No, I am not cold." "I make the suggestion because I understand something of the night," he said. "The coldest hours come before the dawn. You are unwise to sit alone. Come and lean against me, back to back, and sleep then, if you will. I have neither the mind nor the desire to touch you." She shook her head in reply, and pressed her hands together beneath her cloak. She could not see his face, for he sat in shadow, with his profile turned to her. She knew that he was smiling in the darkness, and mocked her for her fear. She was cold, as he had said, and her body craved for warmth, but she would not go to him for protection. Her hands were numb now, and her feet had lost all feeling, and it was as though the granite had become part of her and held her close. Her brain kept falling on and off into a dream, and he walked into it, a giant, fantastic figure with white hair and eyes, who touched her throat and whispered in her ear. She came to a new world peopled with his kind, who barred her progress with outstretched arms. And then she would wake again, stung to reality by the chill wind on her face. And nothing had changed, neither the darkness, nor the mist, nor the night itself, and only 60 seconds gone in time. Sometimes she walked with him in Spain, and he picked her monstrous flowers with purple heads, smiling on her the while. And when she would have thrown them from her, they clung about her skirt like tendrils, creeping to her neck, fastening upon her with poisonous, deadly grip. Or she would ride beside him in a coach, squat and black like a beetle, and the walls closed in upon them both, squeezing them together, pressing the life and the breath from their bodies until they were flat and broken and destroyed, and lay against one another, poised into eternity like 2 slabs of granite. She woke from this dream to certainty, feeling his hand upon her mouth, and this time it was no hallucination of her wandering mind, but grim reality. She would have struggled with him, but he held her fast, speaking harshly in her ear, and bidding her be still. He forced her hands behind her back and bound them, neither hastily nor brutally, but with cool and calm deliberation, using his own belt. The strapping was efficient but not painful, and he ran his finger under the belt to satisfy himself that it would not chafe her skin. She watched him helplessly, feeling his eyes with her own, as though by doing so she might anticipate a message from his brain. Then he took a handkerchief from the pocket of his coat and folded it, and placed it in her mouth, knotting it behind her head, so that speech or cry was now impossible, and she must lie there waiting for the next move in the game. When he had done this, he helped her to her feet, for her legs were free and she could walk, and he led her a little way beyond the granite boulders to the slope of the hill. "I have to do this, Mary, for both our sakes. When we set forth last night upon this expedition, I reckoned without the mist. If I lose now, it will be because of it. Now listen to this, and you will understand why I have bound you, and why your silence may save us yet." He stood on the edge of the hill, holding her arm, and pointing downwards to the white mist below. "Listen," he said. "Your ears may be sharper than mine." She knew now she must have slept longer than she thought, for the darkness had broken above their heads, and morning had come. Clouds were low and straggled across the sky as though interwoven with the mist, while to the east a faint glow heralded the pale, reluctant sun. The fog was with them still, and hid the moors below like a white blanket. She followed the direction of his hand, and could see nothing but mist and the soaking stems of heather. Then she listened, as he had bade her, and far away from beneath the mist there came a sound between a cry and a call, like a summons in the air. It was too faint at first to distinguish, and the tone was strangely pitched, unlike a human voice, unlike the shouting of men. It came nearer, rending the air with some excitement, and Francis Davy turned to Mary, the fog still white on his lashes and his hair. "Do you know what it is?" he said. She stared back at him and shook her head. Nor could she have told him had speech been possible. She had never heard the sound before. He smiled then, a slow, grim smile that cut into his face like a wound. "I heard once, and I had forgotten it, that the Squire of North Hill kept bloodhounds in his kennels. It is a pity for both of us, Mary, that I did not remember." She understood, and with a sudden comprehension of that distant, eager clamour, she looked up at her companion, horror in her eyes, and from him to the two horses standing quietly as ever by the slabs of stone. "Yes," he said, following her glance. "We must let them loose and drive them down to the moors below. They can serve us no longer now, and would only bring the pack upon us. Poor restless, you would betray me once again." She watched him, sick at heart, as he released the horses and led them to the steep slope of the hill. Then he bent to the ground, gathering stones in his hands, and rained blow after blow upon their flanks, so that they slipped and stumbled amongst the wet bracken on the hillside. And then, when his onslaught continued and their instinct jogged them to action, they fled, snorting with terror, down the steep slope of the tor, dislodging boulders and earth in their descent, and so plunged out of sight into the white mists below. The baying of the hounds came nearer now, deep-pitched and persistent, and Francis Davy ran to Mary, stripping himself of his long black coat that hung about his knees, and throwing his hat into the heather. "Come," he said. "Friend or enemy, we share a common danger now." They scrambled up the hill amongst the boulders and the slabs of granite, he with his arm about her, for her bound hands made progress difficult, and they waded in and out of crevice and rock, knee-deep in soaking bracken and black heather, climbing ever higher and higher to the great peak of Rough Tor. Here, on the very summit, the granite was monstrously shaped, tortured and twisted into the semblance of a roof, and Mary lay beneath the great stone slab, breathless and bleeding from her scratches, while he climbed above her, gaining foothold in the hollows of the stone. He reached down to her, and though she shook her head and made sign that she could climb no further, he bent and dragged her to her feet again, cutting at the belt that bound her, and tearing the handkerchief from her mouth. "Save yourself, then, if you can," he shouted, his eyes burning in his pale face, his white halo of hair blowing in the wind. She clung to a table of stone some 10 feet from the ground, panting and exhausted, while he climbed above her and beyond, his lean black figure like a leech on the smooth surface of the rock. The baying of the hounds was unearthly and inhuman, coming as it did from the blanket of fog below, and the chorus was joined by the cries and the shouting of men, a turmoil of excitement that filled the air with sound, and was the more terrible because it was unseen. The clouds moved swiftly across the sky, and the yellow glow of the sun swam into view above a breath of mist. The mist parted and dissolved. It rose from the ground in a twisting column of smoke to be caught up in the passing clouds, and the land that it had covered for so long stared up at the sky, pallid and new-born. Mary looked down upon the sloping hillside, and there were little dots of men standing knee-deep in the heather, the light of the sun shining upon them, while the yelping hounds, crimson-brown against the grey stone, ran before them like rats amongst the boulders. They came fast upon the trail, 50 men or more, shouting and pointing to the great tablets of stone, and as they drew near, the clamour of the hounds echoed in the crevices and whined in the caves. The clouds dissolved as the mist had done, and a patch of sky larger than a man's hand showed blue above their heads. Somebody shouted again, and a man who knelt in the heather scarcely 50 yards from Mary lifted his gun to his shoulder and fired. The shot spat against the granite boulder without touching her, and when he rose to his feet she saw that the man was Jem, and he had not seen her. He fired again, and this time the shot whistled close to her ear, and she felt the breath of its passing upon her face. The hounds were working in and out amongst the bracken, and one of them leapt at the jutting rock beneath her, his great muzzle snuffling the stone. Then Jem fired once more, and looking beyond her, Mary saw the tall black figure of Francis Davy outlined against the sky, standing upon a wide slab like an altar, high above her head. He stood for a moment poised like a statue, his hair blowing in the wind, and then he flung out his arms as a bird throws his wings for flight, and drooped suddenly, and fell, down from his granite peak to the wet, dank heather and the little crumbling stones. Chapter 18. It was a hard, bright day in early January. The ruts and holes in the high road, which were generally inches thick in mud or water, were covered with a thin layer of ice, and the wheel tracks were hoary with frost. This same frost had laid a white hand upon the moors themselves, and they stretched to the horizon, pale and indefinite in colour, a poor contrast to the clear blue sky above. The texture of the ground was crisp, and the short grass crunched beneath the foot like shingle. In a country of lane and hedgerow the sun would have shone warmly, with a make-belief of spring, but here the air was sharp and cutting to the cheek, and everywhere upon the land was the rough, glazed touch of winter. Mary walked alone on 12 men's moor, with the keen wind slapping her face, and she wondered why it was that Kilmar to the left of her had lost his menace, and was now no more than a black-scarred hill under the sky. It might be that anxiety had blinded her to beauty, and she had made confusion in her mind with man and nature. The austerity of the moors had been strangely interwoven with the fear and hatred of her uncle and Jamaica Inn. The moors were bleak still, and the hills were friendless, but their old malevolence had vanished, and she could walk upon them with indifference. She was at liberty now to go where she would, and her thoughts turned to Helford and the green valleys of the south. She had a queer, sick longing for home in her heart, and the sight of warm, familiar faces. The broad river ran from the sea, and the water lapped the beaches. She remembered with pain every scent and sound that had belonged to her so long, and how the creeks branched away from the parent river like wayward children, to lose themselves in the trees and the narrow whispering streams. The woods gave sanctuary to the weary, and there was music in the cool rustle of the leaves in summer, and shelter beneath the naked branches even in winter. She was hungry for birds, and for their flight amongst the trees. She yearned for the homely murmurs of a farm, the cluck of hens, the clarion screech of a cock, and the flustered rasp of geese. She wanted to smell again the rich warm dung in the sheds, and feel the warm breath of cows upon her hands, heavy footsteps treading the yard, and the clank of pails beside the well.
She wanted to lean against a gate and look upon a village lane, give good night to a passing friend, and see the blue smoke curl from the chimneys. There would be voices she would know, rough and gentle, in her ear, and a laugh somewhere from a kitchen window. She would concern herself with the business of her farm, rise early and draw water from the well, move amongst her little flock with confidence and ease, bend her back to labour, and count the strain a joy and an antidote to pain. All seasons could be welcome for the harvest they should bring, and there would be peace and contentment in her mind. She belonged to the soil, and would return to it again, rooted to the earth, as her forefathers had been. Helford had given her birth, and when she died she would be part of it once more. Loneliness was a thing of poor account, and came not into her consideration. A worker paid no heed to solitude, but slept when his day was done. She had determined upon her course, and the way seemed fair and good to follow. She would not linger any more, as she had done during the week, faint and indecisive, but make known her project to the Bassats when she returned for the midday meal. They were kind and full of suggestions, over-full perhaps, with their entreaties that she should stay amongst them for the winter at least, and rather than she should feel a burden upon them, had put to her, with kindly tact, that they would employ her, even in some position in the household, have a care perhaps for the children, be companion to Mrs. Bassat herself. To these conversations she had lent a meek and an unwilling ear, committing nothing, studiously polite, and continually thanking them for what they had already done. The squire, bluff and good-humoured, twitted her at dinner for her silence.
"Come, Mary, smiles and thanks are well enough in their way, but you must make up your mind. You're too young to live alone, you know, and I'll tell you to your face, you're too pretty. There's a home for you here at North Hill, you know that, and my wife joins with me in begging you to stay. Plenty to do, you know, plenty to do. There are flowers to be cut for the house, and letters to write, and the children to scold. Why, you'd have your hands full, I promise you."
And in the library Mrs. Bassat would say much the same, laying a friendly hand on Mary's knee. "We love to have you in the house. Why do you not continue here indefinitely? The children adore you, and Henry told me yesterday you should have his pony if you but said the word, and that is a high tribute from him, I can assure you. We would give you a pleasant, carefree time, with no worries or cares, and you would be a companion to me when Mr. Bassat is away. Do you still fret after your home at Helford?" Then Mary smiled, and thanked her once again. But she could not put into words how much the memory of Helford meant to her. They guessed that the strain of the past months still had its hand upon her, and in their kindness strove to make amends. But the Bassats kept open house at North Hill, and the neighbours called for many miles around, with, naturally enough, one topic of conversation on their lips. 50 and 100 times must Squire Bassat tell his tale, and the name of Algernon and Jamaica become loathsome to Mary's ear, who would be rid of them for ever. Here was another reason for departure. She had become too much an object of curiosity and discussion, and the Bassats, with a little show of pride, would point her as a heroine to their friends. She strove in gratitude to do her best, but she was never at her ease amongst them. They were not her kind. They were another race, another class. She had respect for them, and liking, and goodwill, but she could not love them. In the kindness of their hearts they would have her enter into conversation when company was present, and strove that she should not sit aside, while she longed the while for the silence of her own bedroom, or the homely kitchen of Richards the groom, whose apple-cheeked wife would make her welcome. And the squire, flogging his humour, would turn to her for advice, laughing heartily at every word he said.
"There'll be the living vacant at Aldernon. Will you turn parson, Mary? I warrant you'd make a better one than the last."
And she must smile at this for his sake, wondering that she should be so dull as not to guess the bitter memories his words aroused.
"Well, there'll be no more smuggling at Jamaica Inn," he would say. "And if I could have my way, no drinking either. I'll sweep the place clean of all those cobwebs, and not a poacher nor a gypsy will dare show his face within the walls when I've done with it. I'll put an honest fellow there who's never smelt brandy in his life,
and he shall wear an apron round his waist, and write the word Welcome above the door. And do you know who shall call upon him first? Why, Mary, you and I! Ha, ha!
And he would burst into a shout of laughter, slapping his thigh, while Mary forced a smile in answer, rather than his joke should fail. She thought of these things as she walked alone on 12 Men's Moor, and she knew she must go away from North Hill very soon, for these people were not her people, and only amongst the woods and streams of her own Helford Valley would she know peace and contentment again. There was a cart coming towards her from Kilmar, making tracks in the white frost like a hare. It was the one moving thing upon the silent plain. She watched it in suspicion, but there were no cottages on this moor except Trewartha, away in the valley by the Withy Brook, and Trewartha, she knew, stood empty. Nor had she seen its owner since he had fired at her on Rough Tor.
"He's an ungrateful rascal like the rest of his breed," said the squire. "But for me he'd be in jail now, with a long sentence to serve to break his spirit. I forced his hand, and he had to knuckle under. I grant he did well after that, and was the means of tracing you, Mary, and that black-coated scoundrel. But he's never as much as thanked me for clearing his name in the business, and has taken himself to the world's end now, for all I know. There's never been a Merlyn yet that came to any good, and he'll go the way of the rest of them."
So Trewartha stood empty, and the horses were gone wild with their fellows, and roamed free upon the moors, and their master had ridden away with a song on his lips as she had known he would. The cart came nearer to the slope of the hill, and Mary shielded her eyes from the sun to watch its progress. The horse bent to the strain, and she saw that it laboured beneath a strange load of pots and pans and mattresses and sticks. Someone was making for the country with his home upon his back. Even then she did not tumble to the truth, and it was not until the cart was below her and the driver, walking by the side, looked up to her and waved that she recognized him. She went down towards the cart with a fine show of indifference, and turned at once to the horse to pat him and speak to him, while Jem kicked a stone under the wheel and wedged it there for safety.
"Are you better?"
he called from behind the cart.
"Heard you was sick and had taken to your bed."
"Oh, you must have heard wrong," said Mary. "I've been about the house there at North Hill, and walking in the grounds. There has never been much the matter with me except a hatred for my neighbourhood."
"There was a rumour you were to settle there, and be companion to Mrs. Bassett. That's more like the truth, I suppose. Well, you'll lead a soft enough life with them, I dare say. No doubt they're kindly people when you know them."
"They've been kinder to me than anyone else in Cornwall since my mother died. That's the only thing that matters to me. But I'm not staying in North Hill for all that."
"Oh, you're not?"
"No, I'm going back home to Helford."
"What will you do there?"
"I shall try and start the farm again, or at least work my way to it, for I haven't the money yet. But I've friends there, and friends in Helston, too, that will help me at the beginning."
"Where will you live?"
"Oh, there's not a cottage in the village I couldn't call home if I wanted to. We're neighbourly in the south, you know."
"I've never had neighbours, so I can't contradict you, but I've had the feeling always it would be like living in a box to live in a village. You poke your nose over your gate into another man's garden, and if his potatoes are larger than your own, there's a talking upon it, an argument, and you know that if you cook a rabbit for your supper, he'll have the sniff of it in his kitchen. God damn it, Mary, that's no life for anyone."
She laughed at him, for his nose was wrinkled in disgust, and then she ran her eye over his laden cart and the confusion he had there.
"What are you doing with that?"
she asked him. "I've got a hatred for my neighbourhood, the same as you," he said. "I want to get away from the smell of peat and bog, and the sight of Kilmar yonder, with his ugly face frowning upon me from dusk till dawn. Here's my home, Mary, all I've ever had of it, here in the cart, and I'll take it with me and set it up wherever my fancy takes me. I've been a rover since a boy, never any ties nor roots nor fancies for a length of time, and I dare say I'll die a rover too. 'Tis the only life in the world for me."
"There's no peace, Jem, in wandering, and no quiet. Heaven knows that existence itself is a long enough journey without adding to the burden. There'll come a time when you'll want your own plot of ground, and your 4 walls and your roof, and somewhere to lay your poor tired bones.
The whole country belongs to me, Mary, if it comes to that. With the sky for a roof and the earth for a bed. You don't understand. You're a woman, and your home is your kingdom, and all the little familiar things of day to day. I've never lived like that, and never shall. I'll sleep on the hills one night, and in a city the next. I like to seek my fortune here and there and everywhere, with strangers for company and passers-by for friends. Today I meet a man upon the road, and journey with him for an hour or for a year, and tomorrow he's gone again. Ah, we speak a different language, you and I. We speak a different language, you and I.
Mary went on with her patting of the horse, the good flesh warm and damp beneath her hand, and Jem watched her, the ghost of a smile on his lips.
"Which way will you go?" she said.
"Somewhere east of Tamar. Doesn't matter to me," he said. "I'll never come west again, not until I'm old and grey and have forgotten a lot of things. I thought of striking north after Gunny's Lake and making for the Midlands. They're rich up there, and ahead of everyone. There'll be a fortune there for a man who goes to find it. Perhaps I'll have money in my pockets one day, and buy horses for pleasure, instead of stealing 'em."
"'Tis an ugly black country in the Midlands," said Mary.
"Oh, I don't bother about the colour of the soil. Moorland peat is black, isn't it? And so's the rain when it falls into your pigsties down at Elford. What's the difference?"
"You just talk for argument, Jem. There's no sense in what you say."
"How can I be sensible when you lean against my horse, with your wild, daft hair entangled in his mane, and I know that in 5 or 10 minutes' time I shall be over the hill yonder without you, my face turned towards the Tamar, and you walking back to North Hill to drink tea with Squire Bassat?"
"Delay your journey, then, and come to North Hill, too."
"Oh, don't be a damn fool, Mary. Can you see me drinking tea with the squire, dancing his children on my knee? Oh, I don't belong to his class, neither do you."
"I know that, and I'm going back to Helford because of it. I'm homesick, Jem. I want to smell the river again and walk in my own country."
"Go on, then. Turn your back on me and start walking now. You'll come to a road after 10 miles or so that will take you to Bodmin, and from Bodmin to Truro, and from Truro to Helston. Once in Helston you'll find your friends and make a home with them until your farm is ready for you."
"You are very harsh today, and cruel."
"I'm harsh to my horses when they're obstinate and out of hand, but it doesn't mean I love them any the less."
"You've never loved anything in your life," said Mary.
"I haven't had much use for the word, that's why."
He went round to the back of the cart and kicked the stone away from the wheel.
"What are you doing?" said Mary.
"Well, it's past noon already, and I ought to be on the road. I've havered here long enough. If you were a man, I'd ask you to come with me, and you'd fling your legs over the seat and stick your hands in your pockets and rub shoulders with me for as long as it pleased you."
"I'd do that now if you'd take me south," she said.
"Yes, but I'm bound north, and you're not a man. You're only a woman, as you'd know to your cost if you came with me. Move off from the trace there, Mary, and don't twist the rein. I'm going now. Goodbye."
He took her face in his hands and kissed it, and she saw that he was laughing. "When you're an old maid in mittens down at Elford, you'll remember that," he said, "and it will have to last you to the end of your days. He stole horses, you'll say to yourself, and he didn't care for women, and but for my pride I'd have been with him now." He climbed into the cart and looked down upon her, flicking his whip and yawning.
"I'll do 50 miles before tonight," he said, "and sleep like a puppy at the end of it, in a tent by the side of the road. I'll kindle a fire and cook bacon for my supper. Will you think of me?"
or not?
She did not listen, though. She stood with her face towards the south, hesitating and twisting her hands. Beyond those hills, the bleak moors turned to pasture, and the pasture to valleys and to streams. The peace and quiet of Helford waited for her, beside the running water. "It's not pride," she told him. "You know that it's not pride. There's a sickness in my heart for home, and all the things I've lost." He said nothing, but drew the reins into his hands and whistled to the horse. "Wait," said Mary. "Wait, and hold him still, and give me your hand." He laid the whip aside and reached down to her, and swung her beside him on the driver's seat.
"Oh, what now?" he said. "And where do you want me to take you? You have your back to Alfred, do you know that?"
"Yes, I know," she said.
"If you come with me it'll be a hard life, and a wild one at times, Mary. With no biding anywhere, and little rest and comfort. Men are ill companions when the mood takes 'em, and I, God knows, the worst of 'em. You'll get a poor exchange for your farm, and small prospect of the peace you crave."
"I'll take the risk, Jem, and chance your moods."
"Do you love me, Mary?"
"I believe so, Jem."
"Better than Helford?"
"I can't ever answer that."
"Oh, why you sitting here beside me, then?"
"Because I want to. Because I must. Because, now and forevermore, this is where I long to be," said Mary.
He laughed then, and took her hand and gave her the reins. And she did not look back over her shoulder again, but set her face towards the Tamar.
That was Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. Read by Tony Britton. We do hope you have enjoyed listening to this Chivers audiobook.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this programme.